Section 1 of Letters of Mrs. Adams, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. Letters of Mrs. Adams, Volume 1, by Charles Francis Adams. Section 1, Memoir of Her Life, Part 1, the years between 1744 and 1774. The memorials of that generation by whose efforts the independence of the United States was achieved are in great abundance. There is hardly an event of importance from the year 1765 to the date of the definitive treaty of peace with Great Britain in September 1783 which has not been recorded, either by the industry of actors upon the scene or by the indefatigable activity of a succeeding class of students. These persons have devoted themselves with a highly commendable zeal to the investigation of all particulars, even the most minute, that relate to this interesting period. The individuals called to act most conspicuously in the Revolution have, many of them, left voluminous collections of papers, which, as time passes, find their way to the light of publication, and furnish important illustrations of the feelings and motives under which the contest was carried on. The actors are thus made to stand in bold relief before us. We not only see the public record, but the private commentary also, and these, taken in connection with the contemporaneous histories, all of which, however defective in philosophical analysis, are invaluable depositories of facts related by living witnesses, will serve to transmit to posterity the details for a narration in as complete a form as will in all probability ever be attained by the imperfect faculties of man. Admitting these observations to be true, there is nevertheless a distinction to be drawn between the materials for a history of action and those for one of feeling, between the conduct of men aiming at distinction among their fellow beings, and the private, familiar sentiments that run into the texture of the social system without remark or the hope of observation. Here it is that something like a void in our annals appears still to exist. Our history is for the most part wrapped up in the forms of office. The great men of the Revolution, in the eyes of posterity, are, many of them, like heroes of a mythological age. They are seen for the most part when conscious that they are acting upon a theatre, where individual sentiment must be sometimes disguised and often sacrificed for the public good. Statesmen and generals rarely say all they think or feel. The consequence is that in the papers which come from them they are made to assume a uniform of grave hue, which, though it doubtless exalts the opinion entertained of their perfections, somewhat diminishes the interest with which later generations study their character. Students of human nature seek for examples of man under circumstances of difficulty and trial, man as he is, not as he would appear, but there are many reasons why they are often baffled in the search. We look for the workings of the heart when those of the head alone are presented to us. We watch the emotions of the spirit and yet find clear traces only of the reasoning of the intellect. The solitary meditation, the confidential whisper to a friend never meant to reach the ear of the multitude, the secret wishes not to be blazoned forth to catch applause, the fluctuations between fear and hope that most betray the springs of action, these are the guides to character which most frequently vanish with the moment that called them forth, and leave nothing to posterity but the coarser elements for judgment that may be found in elaborated results. There is, moreover, another distinction to be observed, which is not infrequently lost sight of. It is of great importance not only to understand the nature of the superiority of the individuals who have made themselves a name above their fellow beings, but to estimate the degree in which the excellence for which they were distinguished was shared by those among whom they lived. Inattention to this duty might present Patrick Henry and James Otis, Washington, Jefferson, and Samuel Adams as the causes of the American Revolution, which they were not. There was a moral principle in the field, to the power of which a great majority of the whole population of the colonies, whether male or female, old or young, had been long and habitually trained to do homage. The individuals named, with the rest of their celebrated associates, who best represented that moral principle before the world, were not the originators, but the spokesmen of the general opinion, and instruments for its adaptation to existing events. Whether fighting in the field or deliberating in the Senate, their strength against Great Britain was not that of numbers, nor of wealth, nor of genius, but it drew its nourishment from the sentiment that pervaded the dwellings of the entire population. How much this home sentiment did then and does ever depend upon the character of the female portion of the people will be too readily understood by all to require explanation. The domestic hearth is the first of schools and the best of lecture rooms, for there the heart will cooperate with the mind, the affections with the reasoning power, and this is the scene for the almost exclusive sway of the weaker sex. Yet, great as the influence thus exercised undoubtedly is, it escapes observation in such a manner that history rarely takes much account of it. The maxims of religion, faith, hope, and charity are not passed through the alembic of logical proof before they are admitted into the daily practice of women. They go at once into the teachings of infancy, and thus form the only high and pure motives of which matured manhood can, in its subsequent action, ever boast. Neither, when the stamp of duty is to be struck in the young mind, is there commonly so much alloy in the female heart as with men, with which the genuine metal may be fused and the face of the coin made dim. There is not so much room for the doctrines of expediency and the promptings of private interest to compromise the force of public example. In every instance of domestic convulsions, and when the pruning hook is deserted for the sword and musket, the sacrifice of feelings made by the female sex is unmixed with a hope of worldly compensation. With them there is no ambition to gratify, no fame to be gained by the simply negative virtue of privations suffered in silence. There is no action to drown in its noise and bustle a full sense of the pain that must inevitably attend it. The lot of women in times of trouble is to be a passive spectator of events, which she can scarcely hope to make subservient to her own fame or to control. If it were possible to get at the expression of feelings by women in the heart of a community at a moment of extraordinary trial, recorded in a shape evidently designed to be secret and confidential, this would seem to present the surest and most unfailing index to its general character. Hitherto we have not gathered much of this material in the United States. The dispersion of families so common in America, the consequent destruction of private papers, the defective nature of female education before the Revolution, the difficulty and danger of free communication, and the engrossing character to the men of public and to the women of domestic cares, have all contributed to cut short, if not completely to destroy, the sources of information. It is truly remarked in the present volume that "instances of patience, perseverance, fortitude, magnanimity, courage, humanity, and tenderness, which would have graced the Roman character, were known only to those who were themselves the actors, and whose modesty could not suffer them to blazon abroad their own fame." The heroism of the females of the Revolution has gone from memory with the generation that witnessed it, and nothing, absolutely nothing, remains upon the ear of the young of the present day but the faint echo of an expiring general tradition. Neither is there much remembrance of the domestic manners of the last century, when, with more of admitted distinctions than at present, there was more of general equality; nor of the state of social feeling, or of that simplicity of intercourse which, in colonial times, constituted in New England as near an approach to the successful exemplification of the democratic theory as the irregularity in the natural gifts of men will, in all probability, ever practically allow. It is the purpose of the present volume to contribute something to the supply of this deficiency, by giving to tradition a form partially palpable. The present is believed to be the first attempt in the United States to lay before the public a series of private letters, written without the remotest idea of publication, by a woman to her husband and others of her nearest and dearest relations. Their greatest value consists in the fact, susceptible of no misconception, that they furnish an exact transcript of the feelings of the writer in times of no ordinary trial. Independently of this, the variety of scenes in which she wrote, and the opportunities furnished for observation in the situations in which she was placed by the elevation of her husband to high official positions in the country, may contribute to sustain the interest with which they will be read. The undertaking is, nevertheless, too novel not to inspire the editor with some doubt of its success, particularly as it brings forward to public notice a person who has now been long removed from the scene of action, and of whom it is not unreasonable to suppose the present generation of readers have neither personal knowledge nor recollection. For the sake of facilitating their progress, and explaining the allusions to persons and objects very frequently occurring, it may not be deemed improper here to premise some account of her life. There were few persons of her day and generation who derived their origin or imbibed their character more exclusively from the genuine stock of the Massachusetts Puritan settlers than Abigail Smith. Her father, the Reverend William Smith, was the settled minister of the Congregational Church at Weymouth for more than 40 years, and until his death. Her mother, Elizabeth Quincy, was the granddaughter of the Reverend John Norton, long the pastor of a church of the same denomination in the neighboring town of Hingham, and the nephew of John Norton, well known in the annals of the colony. Her maternal grandfather, John Quincy, was the grandson of Thomas Shepherd, minister of Charlestown, distinguished in his day, and the son of the more distinguished Thomas Shepherd of Cambridge, whose name still lives in one of the churches of that town. These are persons whose merits may be found fully recorded in the pages of Mather and of Neale. They were among the most noted of the most reputed class of their day. In a colony founded so exclusively upon motives of religious zeal as Massachusetts was, it necessarily followed that the ordinary distinctions of society were in a great degree subverted, and that the leaders of the Church, though without worldly possessions to boast of, were the most in honor everywhere. Education was promoted only as it was subsidiary to the great end of studying or expounding the Scriptures, and whatever of advance was made in the intellectual pursuits of society was rather the incidental than the direct result of studies necessary to fit men for a holy calling. Hence it was that the higher departments of knowledge were entered almost exclusively by the clergy. Classical learning was a natural, though indirect, consequence of the acquisition of those languages in which the New Testament and the Fathers were to be studied, and dialectics formed the armor of which men were compelled to learn the use, as a preparation for the wars of religious controversy. The mastery of these gave power and authority to their possessors, who, by a very natural transition, passed from being the guides of religious faith to their fellow men, to be guardians of their education. To them, as the fountains of knowledge, and possessing the gifts most prized in the community, all other ranks in society cheerfully gave place. If a festive entertainment was meditated, the minister was sure to be first on the list of those to be invited. If any assembly of citizens was held, he must be there to open the business with prayer. If a political measure was in agitation, he was among the first whose opinion was to be consulted. Even the civil rights of the other citizens for a long time depended in some degree upon his good word, and after this rigid rule was laid aside, he yet continued, in the absence of technical law and lawyers, to be the arbiter and the judge in the differences between his fellow men. He was not infrequently the family physician. The great object of instruction being religious, the care of the young was also in his hands. The records of Harvard University, the child and darling of Puritan affections, show that of all the presiding officers during the century and a half of colonial days, but 2 were laymen and not ministers of the prevailing denomination, and that of all who in the early times availed themselves of such advantages as this institution could then offer, nearly half the number did so for the sake of devoting themselves to the service of the gospel. But the prevailing notion of the purpose of education was attended with one remarkable consequence. The cultivation of the female mind was regarded with utter indifference. It is not impossible that the early example of Mrs. Hutchinson, and the difficulties in which the public exercise of her gifts involved the colony, had established in the public mind a conviction of the danger that may attend the meddling of women with abstruse points of doctrine, and these, however they might confound the strongest intellect, were, nevertheless, the favorite topics of thought and discussion in that generation. Waiving a decision upon this, it may very safely be assumed, not only that there was very little attention given to the education of women, but that, as Mrs. Adams in one of her letters says, "It was fashionable to ridicule female learning." The only chance for much intellectual improvement in the female sex was, therefore, to be found in the families of that which was the educated class, and in occasional intercourse with the learned of their day. Whatever of useful instruction was received in the practical conduct of life came from maternal lips, and what of further mental development depended more upon the eagerness with which the casual teachings of daily conversation were treasured up than upon any labor expended purposely to promote it. Abigail Smith was the second of 3 daughters. Her father, as has been already mentioned, was the minister of a small congregational church in the town of Weymouth during the middle of the last century. She was born in that town on the 11th of November, 1744, Old Style. In her neighborhood there were not many advantages of instruction to be found, and even in Boston, the small metropolis nearest at hand, for reasons already stated, the list of accomplishments within the reach of females was probably very short. She did not enjoy an opportunity to acquire even such as there might have been, for the delicate state of her health forbade the idea of sending her away from home to obtain them. In a letter, written in 1817, the year before her death, speaking of her own deficiencies, she says, "My early education did not partake of the abundant opportunities which the present days offer, and which even our common country schools now afford. I never was sent to any school. I was always sick. Female education in the best families went no further than writing and arithmetic, in some few and rare instances, music and dancing." Hence it is not unreasonable to suppose that the knowledge gained by her was rather the result of the society into which she was thrown than of any elaborate instruction. This fact, that the author of the letters in the present volume never went to any school, is a very important one to the proper estimate of her character. For whatever may be the decision of the long vexed question between the advantages of public and those of private education, few persons will deny that they produce marked differences in the formation of character. Seclusion from companions of the same age, at any time of life, is calculated to develop the imaginative faculty at the expense of the judgment, but especially in youth, when the most durable impressions are making. The ordinary consequence in females of a meditative turn of mind is the indulgence of romantic and exaggerated sentiments drawn from books, which, if subjected to the ordinary routine of large schools, are worn down by the attrition of social intercourse. These ideas, formed in solitude in early life, often, though not always, remain in the mind even after the realities of the world surround those who hold them, and counteract the tendency of their conclusions. They are constantly visible in the letters of these volumes, even in the midst of the severest trials. They form what may be considered the romantic turn of the author's mind. But in her case they were so far modified by a great admixture of religious principle and by natural good sense, as to be of eminent service in sustaining her through the painful situations in which she was placed, instead of nursing that species of sickly sensibility which too frequently, in similar circumstances, impairs, if it does not destroy, the power of practical usefulness. At Mount Wollaston, a part of Braintree, the town next adjoining Weymouth, lived Colonel John Quincy, her grandfather on the mother's side, and a gentleman who for many years enjoyed in various official situations much of the confidence of the colony. At his house, and under the instruction of his wife, her grandmother, she appears to have imbibed most of the lessons which made the deepest impression upon her mind. Of this lady, the daughter of the Reverend John Norton, nothing is now known but what the frequent and cheerful acknowledgment of her merit by her disciple tells us. "I have not forgotten," says the latter to her own daughter in the year 1795, "the excellent lessons which I received from my grandmother at a very early period of life. I frequently think they made a more durable impression upon my mind than those which I received from my own parents. Whether it was owing to the happy method of mixing instruction and amusement together, or from an inflexible adherence to certain principles, the utility of which I could not but see and approve when a child, I know not, but maturer years have rendered them oracles of wisdom to me. I love and revere her memory. Her lively, cheerful disposition animated all around her, whilst she edified all by her unaffected piety. This tribute is due to the memory of those virtues, the sweet remembrance of which will flourish though she has long slept with her ancestors." Again, in another letter to the same person in 1808, she says, "I cherish her memory with holy veneration, whose maxims I have treasured up, whose virtues live in my remembrance, happy if I could say they have been transplanted into my life." But though her early years were spent in a spot of so great seclusion as her grandfather's house must then have been, it does not appear that she remained wholly unacquainted with young persons of her own sex and age. She had relations and connections, both on the father's and on the mother's side, and with these she was upon as intimate terms as circumstances would allow. The distance between the homes of the young people was, however, too great, and the means of their parents too narrow, to admit of very frequent personal intercourse, the substitute for which was a rapid interchange of written communications. The letter-writing propensity manifested itself early in this youthful circle. A considerable number of the epistles of her correspondence have been preserved among the papers of Mrs. Adams. They are deserving of notice only as they furnish a general idea of the tastes and pursuits of the young women of that day. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about them is the evident influence upon the writers which the study of The Spectator and of the poets appears to have had. This is perceptible in the more important train of thought and structure of language, as well as in the lesser trifles of the taste for quotation and for fictitious signatures. Calliope and Myra, Arpasia and Aurelia, have effectually succeeded in disguising their true names from the eyes of younger generations. The signature of Miss Smith appears to have been Diana, a name which she dropped after her marriage, without losing the fancy that prompted to its selection. Her letters during the Revolution show clearly enough the tendency of her own thoughts and feelings in the substitute she then adopted of Portia. Her fondness for quotations, the fashion of that day, it will be seen, was maintained through life. Perhaps there is no species of exercise in early life more productive of results useful to the mind than that of writing letters. Over and above the mechanical facility of constructing sentences, which no teaching will afford so well, the interest with which the object is commonly pursued gives an extraordinary impulse to the intellect. This is promoted in a degree proportionate to the scarcity of temporary and local subjects for discussion. Where there is little gossip, the want of it must be supplied from books. The flowers of literature spring up where the weeds of scandal take no root. The young ladies of Massachusetts in the last century were certainly readers, even though only self-taught, and their taste was not for the feeble and nerveless sentiment or the frantic passion which comes from the novels and romances in the circulating library of our day, but was derived from the deepest wells of English literature. The poets and moralists of the mother country furnished to these inquiring minds their ample stores, and they were used to an extent which it is at least doubtful if the more pretending and elaborate instruction of the present generation would equal. Of Mrs. Adams's letters during this period of her youth, but very few remain in possession of her descendants. One specimen has been accidentally obtained, which makes the first in the present publication. The writer was at the date of the letter not quite 17, and was addressing a lady some years older than herself. This may account for a strain of gravity rather beyond her years or ordinary disposition. 2 other letters, written to Mr. Adams after she was betrothed and before she was married to him, have been added, because they are believed to be more indicative of her usual temper at that age. These have been admitted to a place in the selection, not so much as claiming a particular merit, as because they are thought to furnish a standard of her mind and general character when a girl, by which the improvement and full development of her powers as a woman may readily be measured. The father of Mrs. Adams was a pious man, with something of that vein of humor not uncommon among the clergy of New England, which ordinarily found such a field for exercise as is displayed in the pages of Cotton Mather. He was the father of 3 daughters, all of them women of uncommon force of intellect, though the fortunes of 2 of them confined its influence to a sphere much more limited than that which fell to the lot of Mrs. Adams. Mary, the eldest, was married in 1762 to Richard Cranch, an English emigrant who had settled at Germantown, a part of Braintree, and who subsequently became a judge of the Court of Common Pleas in Massachusetts, and died highly respected in the early part of the present century. The present William Cranch of Washington, who has presided so long and with so much dignity and fidelity over the Circuit Court of the District of Columbia, is the son of this marriage. Elizabeth, the youngest, was twice married, first to the Reverend John Shaw, minister of Haverhill in Massachusetts, and after his death to the Reverend Mr. Peabody of Atkinson, New Hampshire. Thus much is necessary to be stated in order to explain the relations which the parties in many of the letters bore to each other. It is an anecdote told of Mr. Smith that upon the marriage of his eldest daughter he preached to his people from the text of the 42nd verse of the 10th chapter of Luke, "And Mary hath chosen that good part which shall not be taken away from her." 2 years elapsed, and his second daughter, the subject of this notice, was about to marry John Adams, than a lawyer in good practice, when some disapprobation of the match appears to have manifested itself among a portion of his parishioners. The profession of law was, for a long period in the colonial history of Massachusetts, unknown, and after circumstances called it forth, the prejudices of the inhabitants, who thought it a calling hardly honest, were arrayed against those who adopted it. There are many still living who can remember how strong they remained, even down to the time of the adoption of the present Federal Constitution, and the records of the General Court at its very last session of 1840 will show that they have not quite disappeared at this day. Besides this, the family of Mr. Adams, the son of a small farmer of the middle class in Braintree, was thought scarcely good enough to match with the minister's daughter, descended from so many of the shining lights of the colony. It is probable that Mr. Smith was made aware of the opinions expressed among his people, for he is said, immediately after the marriage took place, to have replied to them by a sermon, the text of which, in evident allusion to the objection against lawyers, was drawn from Luke chapter 7, verse 33, "For John came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and ye say, He hath a devil." Mrs. Adams was married on the 25th of October, 1764, having then nearly completed her 20th year. The 10 years immediately following present little that is worthy of recording. She appears to have passed a quiet and apparently very happy life, having her residence in Braintree or in Boston, according as the state of her husband's health, then rather impaired, or that of his professional practice made the change advisable. Within this period she became the mother of a daughter and of 3 sons, whose names will frequently appear in her letters, and her domestic cares were relieved by the presence of her husband, who was absent from home only upon those occasions when he, with the other lawyers of his time, was compelled to follow the court in its circuits. During these times he used to write regularly to his wife an account of his adventures and of his professional success. These letters remain, and furnish a curious record of the manners and customs of the provincial times. She does not appear to have often replied to them. The only example is given in the present volume, and makes the 4th of the selection, a letter remarkable only for the picture it presents of peaceful domestic life, in contrast to the stormy period immediately succeeding. End of section 1. Section 2 of Letters of Mrs. Adams, Volume 1, by Charles Francis Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sue Anderson. Section 2, Youthful Letters, 1761-1767. Weymouth, 5 October 1761. To Mrs. H. Lincoln. My dear friend, does not my friend think me a stupid girl when she has kindly offered to correspond with me, that I should be so senseless as not to accept the offer? Senseless and stupid I would confess myself, and that to the greatest degree, if I did not foresee the many advantages I shall receive from corresponding with a lady of your known prudence and understanding. I gratefully accept your offer, although I may be charged with vanity in pretending to entertain you with my scrawls. Yet I know your generosity is such, that, like a kind parent, you will bury in oblivion all my imperfections. I do not aim at entertaining. I write merely for the instruction and edification which I shall receive, provided you honor me with your correspondence. Your letter I received, and believe me, it has not been through forgetfulness that I have not before this time returned you my sincere thanks for the kind assurance you then gave me of continued friendship. You have, I hope, pardoned my suspicions. They arose from love. What persons in their right senses would calmly, and without repining or even inquiring into the cause, submit to lose their greatest temporal good and happiness? For thus the divine Dr. Young looks upon a true friend when he says, "A friend is worth all hazards we can run. Poor is the friendless master of a world. A world in purchase for a friend is gain." Who that has once been favored with your friendship can be satisfied with the least diminution of it? Not those who value it according to its worth. You have, like King Ahasuerus, held forth, though not a golden scepter, yet one more valuable, the scepter of friendship, if I may so call it. Like Esther, I would draw nigh and touch it. Will you proceed and say, "What wilt thou? And what is thy request? It shall be even given thee to the half of my heart." Why, no, I think I will not have so dangerous a present, lest your good man should find it out and challenge me. But if you please, I'll have a place in one corner of it, a place well guarded and fortified, or still I shall fear being jostled out by him. Now do not deny my request on purpose to make me feel the weight of your observation that we are often disappointed when we set our minds upon that which is to yield us great happiness. I know it too well already. Daily experience teaches me that truth. And now let me ask you, my friend, whether you do not think that many of our disappointments and much of our unhappiness arise from our forming false notions of things and persons. We strangely impose upon ourselves. We create a fairyland of happiness. Fancy is fruitful and promises fair, but like the dog in the fable, we catch at a shadow, and when we find the disappointment we are vexed not with ourselves, who are really the impostors, but with the poor innocent thing or person of whom we have formed such strange ideas. When this is the case, I believe we always find that we have enjoyed more pleasure in the anticipation than in the real enjoyment of our wishes. Dr. Young says, "Our wishes give us not our wishes." Some disappointments are indeed more grievous than others. Since they are our lot, let us bear them with patience. That person that cannot bear a disappointment must not live in a world so changeable as this. And 'tis wise it should be so, for were we to enjoy a continual prosperity, we should be too firmly attached to the world ever to think of quitting it, and there would be no room to fear that we should be so far intoxicated with prosperity as to swim smoothly from joy to joy along life's short current, wholly unmindful of the vast ocean, eternity. If I did not know that it would be adding to the length of my letter, I might make some excuse for it, but that and another reason will hinder me. You bid me tell one of my sparks, I think that was the word, to bring me to see you. Why, I believe you think they are as plenty as herrings, when, alas, there is as great a scarcity of them as there is of justice, honesty, prudence, and many other virtues. I've no pretensions to one. Wealth is the only thing that is looked after now. 'Tis said Plato thought, if virtue would appear to the world, all mankind would be enamored with her. But now interest governs the world, and men neglect the golden mean. But to be sober, I should really rejoice to come and see you, but if I wait till I get a, what did you call 'em? I fear you'll be blind with age. I can say in the length of this epistle, I've made the golden rule mine. Pray, my friend, do not let it be long before you write to your ever affectionate A.S. P.S. My regards to your good man. I've no acquaintance with him, but if you love him, I do, and should be glad to see him. Weymouth, 16 April, 1764. To John Adams. Note: Mr. Adams was in Boston undergoing the process, then in vogue, of inoculation with the smallpox. My friend, I think I write to you every day. Shall not I make my letters very cheap? Don't you light your pipe with them? I care not if you do. 'Tis a pleasure to me to write. Yet I wonder I write to you with so little restraint, for as a critic I fear you more than any other person on earth, and 'tis the only character in which I ever did or ever will fear you. What say you? Do you approve of that speech? Don't you think me a courageous being? Courage is a laudable, a glorious virtue in your sex. Why not in mine? For my part, I think you ought to applaud me for mine. Exit Rattle. Solus your Diana. And now, pray tell me, how do you do? Do you feel any venom working in your veins? Did you ever before experience such a feeling? This letter will be made up with questions, I fancy, not set in order before you, neither. How do you employ yourself? Do you go abroad yet? Is it not cruel to bestow those favors upon others which I should rejoice to receive, yet must be deprived of? I have lately been thinking whether my mamma— When I write again I will tell you something. Did you not receive a letter to-day by Haynes? This is a right girl's letter, but I will turn to the other side and be sober, if I can. But what is bred in the bone will never be out of the flesh, as Lord M. would have said. As I have a good opportunity to send some milk, I have not waited for your orders, lest if I should miss this, I should not catch such another. If you want more balm, I can supply you. Adieu. Evermore remember me with the tenderest affection, which is also borne unto you by your A. Smith. Thursday evening, Weymouth, 19 April, 1764. To John Adams. Why, my good man, thou hast the curiosity of a girl. Who could have believed that only a slight hint would have set thy imagination agog in such a manner? And a fine encouragement I have to unravel the mystery, as thou callest it. Nothing less truly than to be told something to my disadvantage. What an excellent reward that will be! In what court of justice did thou learn that equity? I thank thee, friend, such knowledge as that is easy enough to be obtained without paying for it. As to the insinuation, it doth not give me any uneasiness, for if it is anything very bad, I know thou dost not believe it. I am not conscious of any harm that I have done or wished to any mortal. I bear no malice to any being. To my enemies, if any I have, I am willing to afford assistance. Therefore, towards man, I maintain a conscience void of offense. Yet by this I mean not that I am faultless. But tell me, what is the reason that persons would rather acknowledge themselves guilty than to be accused by others? Is it because they are more tender of themselves, or because they meet with more favor from others when they ingenuously confess? Let that be as it will, there is something which makes it more agreeable to condemn ourselves than to be condemned by others. But although it is vastly disagreeable to be accused of faults, yet no person ought to be offended when such accusations are delivered in the spirit of friendship. I now call upon you to fulfill your promise, and tell me all my faults, both of omission and commission, and all the evil you either know or think of me. Be to me a second conscience, nor put me off to a more convenient season. There can be no time more proper than the present. It will be harder to erase them when habit has strengthened and confirmed them. Do not think I trifle. These are really meant as words of truth and soberness. For the present, good night. Friday morning, April 20th. What does it signify? Why may not I visit you days as well as nights? I no sooner close my eyes than some invisible being, swift as the albarak of Mohammed, bears me to you. I see you, but cannot make myself visible to you. That tortures me, but it is still worse when I do not come, for I am then haunted by half a dozen ugly sprites. One will catch me and leap into the sea. Another will carry me up a precipice like that which Edgar describes in Lear, then toss me down, and were I not then light as the gossamer, I would shiver into atoms. Another will be pouring down my throat stuff worse than the witch's broth in Macbeth. Where I shall be carried next I know not, but I would rather have the smallpox by inoculation half a dozen times than be sprited about as I am. What say you? Can you give me any encouragement to come? By the time you receive this, I hope from experience you will be able to say that the distemper is but a trifle. Think you I would not endure a trifle for the pleasure of seeing you? Yes, were it 10 times that trifle, I would. But my own inclinations must not be followed. To duty I sacrifice them. Yet, oh my mamma, forgive me if I say you have forgot or never knew, but hush, and do you excuse me that something I promised you, since it was a speech more undutiful than that which I just now stopped myself in. For the present, good-bye. Friday evening. I hope you smoke your letters well before you deliver them. Mamma is so fearful lest I should catch the distemper that she hardly ever thinks the letters are sufficiently purified. Did you ever rob a bird's nest? Do you remember how the poor bird would fly round and round, fearful to come nigh, yet not know how to leave the place? Just so they say I hover round Tom whilst he is smoking my letters. But heyday, Mr. What's-your-name, who taught you to threaten so vehemently? A character besides that of a critic, in which if I never did, I always hereafter shall fear you. Thou canst not prove a villain. Impossible. I therefore still insist upon it, that I neither do nor can fear thee. For my part, I know not that there is any pleasure in being feared, but if there is, I hope you will be so generous as to fear your Diana, that she may at least be made sensible of the pleasure. Mr. Ayers will bring you this letter and the bag. Do not repine, it is filled with balm. Here is love, respects, regards, good wishes, a whole wagon load of them, sent you from all the good folks in the neighborhood. Tomorrow makes the 14th day. How many more are to come? I dare not trust myself with the thought. Adieu. Let me hear from you by Mr. Ayers, and excuse this very bad writing. If you had mended my pen it would have been better. Once more adieu. Gold and silver have I none, but such as I have give I unto thee, which is the affectionate regard of your A.S. Weymouth, Sunday evening, 14 September, 1767. To John Adams. My dearest friend, the doctor talks of setting out tomorrow for New Braintree. I did not know but that he might chance to see you in his way there. I know from the tender affection you bear me and our little ones, that you will rejoice to hear that we are well. Our son is much better than when you left home, and our daughter rocks him to sleep with the song of "Come, Papa, come home to brother Johnny." Sunday seems a more lonely day to me than any other when you are absent, for though I may be compared to those climates which are deprived of the sun half the year, yet upon a Sunday you commonly afforded us your benign influence. I am now at Weymouth. My father brought me here last night. To morrow I return home, where I hope soon to receive the dearest of friends and the tenderest of husbands, with that unabated affection which has for years past, and will while the vital spark lasts, burn in the bosom of your affectionate A. Adams. Section 3 of Letters of Mrs. Adams, Volume 1, by Charles Francis Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sue Anderson. Section 3, The Memoir, Part 2. It is said by Governor Hutchison, in the 3rd volume of his history, that neither the health of Mr. Adams nor his business admitted of his constant application to public affairs in the manner that distinguished his kinsman Samuel Adams during the years preceding the breaking out of the Revolution. If the sum of that application is to be measured by the frequency of his appearance before the public as an actor in an official character upon the scene, the remark is true, for up to the year 1774 he had served but once or twice as a representative in the General Court, and in no other situation. But this would furnish a very unfair standard by which to try the extent of his labors for the public. Very often as much is done by beforehand preparing the public mind for action as by the conduct of that action after it has been commenced, although the visible amount of exertion by which alone the world forms its judgments is in the two cases widely different. From the time of his marriage in 1764, perhaps still earlier, when he, as a young lawyer, in 1761, took notes of the argument in the celebrated cause of the writs of assistance, there is evidence constantly presented of his active interest in the revolutionary struggle. There is hardly a year in the interval between the earliest of these dates and 1774 that the traces of his hand are not visible in the newspapers of Boston, elaborately discussing the momentous questions which preceded the crisis. It was during this period that the Essay on Canon and Feudal Law was written. A long controversy with Major Brattle upon the payment of the judges and the papers of Novanglus were other, though by no means all, the results of his labors. He drafted several of the papers of instruction to the representatives to the General Court, both in Boston and in his native town, and also some of the most elaborate legal portions of the celebrated controversy between that body and Governor Hutchison. The tendency, which all these papers show, to seek for political truth in its fundamental principles and most abstract forms, whilst it takes off much from the interest with which the merely general reader would now consider them, is yet of historical importance, as establishing the fact how little of mere impulse there was in his mode of action against the mother country. They also show the extent of the studies to which his mind applied itself, and the depth of the foundation laid by him for his subsequent career. Yet during all this time his professional labors were never intermitted, and ceased only with the catastrophe which shut up the courts of justice and rendered exertion upon a different theatre absolutely necessary to the maintenance of the fabric of society. Perhaps the preceding detail belongs more properly to a memoir of Mr. Adams than to that of his wife. Yet it would be impossible to furnish any accurate idea of her character without explaining the precise nature of the influences acting upon her whilst still young, and when that character was taking its permanent form. There was no one who witnessed his studies with greater interest, or who sympathized with him in the conclusions to which his mind was forcing him more deeply than Mrs. Adams. And hence it was that as the day of trial came, and the hour for action drew near, she was found not unprepared to submit to the lot appointed her. Mr. Adams was elected one of the delegates on the part of Massachusetts, instructed to meet persons chosen in the same manner from the other colonies, for the purpose of consulting in common upon the course most advisable to be adopted by them. In the month of August, 1774, he left home in company with Samuel Adams, Thomas Cushing, and Robert Treat Paine, to go to Philadelphia, at which place the proposed assembly was to be held. It is from this period that the correspondence, Mrs. Adams's portion of which is now submitted to the public, becomes interesting. The letter of the 19th of August of this year portrays her own feelings upon this, the first separation of importance from her husband, and the anxiety with which she was watching the course of events. Yet there is in it not a syllable of regret for the past, or of fear for the future, but, on the contrary, an acute perception of the obstacles in the way of an immediate return to peaceful times, and a deliberate preparation, by reading and reflection, for the worst. The Congress confined itself, in its first sessions, to consultation and remonstrance. It therefore adjourned after the lapse of only 2 months. It is during this time that the 5 letters in the present volume, which bear the date in 1774, were written. They furnish a lively exhibition of the state of public feeling in Massachusetts. That, dated on the 14th of September, is particularly interesting, as it gives an account of the securing the gunpowder from the British in her own town of Braintree, as well as a highly characteristic trait of New England in the refusal to cheer on a Sunday. The last of this series, dated on the 16th of October, shows that all remaining hopes of peace and reconciliation were fast vanishing from her mind, and in an affecting manner she bids adieu to domestic felicity, perhaps until the meeting with her husband in another world, since she looks forward to nothing further in this than sacrifices as the result of the impending contest. End of section 3. Section 4 of Letters of Mrs. Adams, Volume 1, by Charles Francis Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sue Anderson. Section 4, The Letters, 1774. Braintree, 19 August, 1774. To John Adams. The great distance between us makes the time appear very long to me. It seems already a month since you left me. The great anxiety I feel for my country, for you, and for our family, renders the day tedious and the night unpleasant. The rocks and quicksands appear upon every side. What course you can or will take is all wrapped in the bosom of futurity. Uncertainty and expectation leave the mind great scope. Did ever any kingdom or state regain its liberty when once it was invaded without bloodshed? I cannot think of it without horror. Yet we are told that all the misfortunes of Sparta were occasioned by their too great solicitude for present tranquillity, and from an excessive love of peace they neglected the means of making it sure and lasting. They ought to have reflected, says Polybius, that as there is nothing more desirable or advantageous than peace when founded in justice and honor, so there is nothing more shameful and at the same time more pernicious when attained by bad measures and purchased at the price of liberty. I have received a most charming letter from our friend Mrs. Warren, note Mrs. Mercy Warren, the wife of General James Warren of Plymouth, and the sister of James Otis. She desires me to tell you that her best wishes attend you through your journey, both as a friend and a patriot. Hopes you will have no uncommon difficulties to surmount, or hostile movements to impede you. But if the Locrians should interrupt you, She hopes that you will be aware that no future annals may say you chose an ambitious Philip for your leader, who subverted the noble order of the American Amphictyons and built up a monarchy on the ruins of the happy institution. I have taken a very great fondness for reading Rollin's Ancient History since you left me. I am determined to go through with it, if possible, in these my days of solitude. I find great pleasure and entertainment from it, and I have persuaded Johnny to read me a page or two every day, and hope he will, from his desire to oblige me, entertain a fondness for it. We have had a charming rain, which lasted 12 hours, and has greatly revived the dying fruits of the earth. I want much to hear from you. I long impatiently to have you upon the stage of action. The 1st of September, or the month of September perhaps, may be of as much importance to Great Britain as the Ides of March were to Caesar. I wish you every public as well as private blessing, and that wisdom which is profitable both for instruction and edification, to conduct you in this difficult day. The little flock remember Papa, and kindly wish to see him. So does your most affectionate Abigail Adams. Braintree, 2 September, 1774. To John Adams. I am very impatient to receive a letter from you. You indulged me so much in that way in your last absence, that I now think I have a right to hear as often from you as you have leisure and opportunity to write. I hear that Mr. Adams (Mr. Samuel Adams) wrote to his son, and the Speaker (Mr. Cushing) to his lady, but perhaps you did not know of the opportunity. I suppose you have before this time received 2 letters from me, and will write me by the same conveyance. I judge you reached Philadelphia last Saturday night. I cannot but felicitate you upon your absence a little while from this scene of perturbation, anxiety, and distress. I feel not a little agitated with the accounts I have this day received from town. Great commotions have arisen in consequence of a discovery of a traitorous plot of Colonel Brattle's, his advice to Gage to break every commissioned officer, and to seize the provinces and towns' stock of gunpowder. This has so enraged and exasperated the people that there is great apprehension of an immediate rupture. They have all been in flames ever since the new-fangled councillors have taken their oaths. The importance, of which they consider the meeting of the Congress, and the result thereof to the community, withholds the arm of vengeance already lifted, which would most certainly fall with accumulated wrath upon Brattle, were it possible to come at him. But no sooner did he discover that his treachery had taken air than he fled, not only to Boston, but into the camp for safety. You will, by Mr. Tudor, no doubt, have a much more accurate account than I am able to give you. But one thing I can inform you of, which perhaps you may not have heard, namely, Mr. Vinton, our sheriff, it seems, received one of those 20 warrants. These were warrants issued by the clerks of the court by which the juries were summoned, which were issued by Messrs. Goldthwaite and Price, which has cost them bitter repentance and humble acknowledgments, and which has revealed the great secret of their attachment to the liberties of their country, and their veneration and regard for the goodwill of their countrymen. See their address to Hutchison and Gage. This warrant, which was for Stoutenham, Vinton carried and delivered to a constable there, but before he had got 6 miles he was overtaken by 60 men on horseback, who surrounded him and told him unless he returned with them and demanded back that warrant and committed it to the flames before their faces, he must take the consequences of a refusal. and he, not thinking it best to endure their vengeance, returned with them, made his demand of the warrant, and consumed it, upon which they dispersed and left him to his own reflections. Since the news of the Quebec bill arrived, all the church people here have hung their heads, and will not converse upon politics, though ever so much provoked by the opposite party. Before that, parties ran very high, and very hard words and threats of blows upon both sides were given out. They have had their town meeting here, which was full as usual, chose their committee for the county meeting, and did business without once regarding or fearing for the consequences. I should be glad to know how you found the people as you traveled from town to town. I hear you met with great hospitality and kindness in Connecticut. Pray let me know how your health is, and whether you have not had exceeding hot weather. The drought has been very severe. My poor cows will certainly prefer a petition to you, setting forth their grievances, and informing you that they have been deprived of their ancient privileges, whereby they are become great sufferers, and desiring that they may be restored to them, more especially as their living, by reason of the drought, is all taken from them, and their property which they hold elsewhere is decaying. They humbly pray that you would consider them, lest hunger should break through stone walls. The tenderest regard evermore awaits you from your most affectionate Abigail Adams. Braintree, 14 September 1774. To John Adams. Dearest friend, 5 weeks have passed and not one line have I received. I would rather give $1 for a letter by the post, though the consequence should be that I ate but 1 meal a day these 3 weeks to come. Every one I see is inquiring after you. When did I hear? All my intelligence is collected from the newspaper, and I can only reply that I saw by that you arrived such a day. I know your fondness for writing, and your inclination to let me hear from you by the first safe conveyance, which makes me suspect that some letter or other has miscarried. But I hope, now you have arrived at Philadelphia, you will find means to convey me some intelligence. We are all well here. I think I enjoy better health than I have done these 2 years. I have not been to town since I parted with you there. The governor is making all kinds of warlike preparations, such as mounting cannon upon Beacon Hill, digging intrenchments upon the Neck, placing cannon there, encamping a regiment there, throwing up breastworks, etc. The people are much alarmed, and the selectmen have waited upon him in consequence of it. The county congress have also sent a committee, all which proceedings you will have a more particular account of than I am able to give you from the public papers. But as to the movements of this town, perhaps you may not hear them from any other person. In consequence of the powder being taken from Charlestown, a general alarm spread through many towns, and was caught pretty soon here. The report took here on Friday, and on Sunday a soldier was seen lurking about the common, supposed to be a spy, but most likely a deserter. However, intelligence of it was communicated to the other parishes, and about 8 o'clock Sunday evening there passed by here about 200 men, preceded by a horse cart, and marched down to the powder house, from whence they took the powder and carried it into the other parish and there secreted it. I opened the window upon their return. They passed without any noise, not a word among them till they came against this house, when some of them, perceiving me, asked me if I wanted any powder. I replied no, since it was in so good hands. The reason they gave for taking it was, that we had so many Tories here they dared not trust us with it. They had taken Vinton in their train, and upon their return they stopped between Cleverly's and Etter's, and called upon him to deliver 2 warrants. Upon his producing them, They put it to vote whether they should burn them, and it passed in the affirmative. They then made a circle and burnt them. They then called a vote whether they should huzza, but it being Sunday evening, it passed in the negative. They called upon Vinton to swear that he would never be instrumental in carrying into execution any of these new acts. They were not satisfied with his answers. However, they let him rest. A few days afterwards, upon his making some foolish speeches, they assembled to the amount of 200 or 300, and swore vengeance upon him unless he took a solemn oath. Accordingly, they chose a committee, and sent it with him to Major Miller's to see that he complied, and they waited his return, which proving satisfactory, they dispersed. This town appears as high as you can well imagine, and if necessary would soon be in arms. Not a Tory but hides his head. The church parson thought they were coming after him, and ran up garret. They say another jumped out of his window and hid among the corn, while a third crept under his board fence and told his beads. 16 September 1774. I dined today at Colonel Quincy's. They were so kind as to send me and Abby and Betsy an invitation to spend the day with them, and as I had not been to see them since I removed to Braintree, I accepted the invitation. After I got there came Mr. Samuel Quincy's wife and Mr. Sumner, Mr. Josiah and wife. A little clashing of parties, you may be sure. Note: it is well known that these two brothers took opposite sides in the struggle that ensued. Mr. Sam's wife said she thought it high time for her husband to turn about. He had not done half so cleverly since he left her advice. Said they both greatly admired the most excellent speech of the Bishop of St. Asaph, which I suppose you have seen. It meets and most certainly merits the greatest encomiums. Upon my return at night, Mr. Thaxter met me at the door with your letter dated at Princeton, New Jersey. It really gave me such a flow of spirits that I was not composed enough to sleep until 1 o'clock. You make no mention of one I wrote you previous to that you received by Mr. Breck and sent by Mr. Cunningham. I am rejoiced to hear you are well. I want to know many more particulars than you write me, and hope soon to hear from you again. I dare not trust myself with the thought how long you may perhaps be absent. I only count the weeks already past, and they amount to 5. I am not so lonely as I should have been without my 2 neighbors. We make a tableful at meal times. All the rest of their time they spend in the office. Never were 2 persons who gave a family less trouble than they do. It is at last determined that Mr. Rice keep the school here. Indeed, he has kept ever since he has been here, but not with any expectation that he should be continued. But the people, finding no small difference between him and his predecessor, chose he should be continued. I have not sent Johnny. Note her son, John Quincy Adams. He goes very steadily to Mr. Thaxter, who I believe takes very good care of him, and as they seem to have a liking to each other, I believe it will be best to continue him with him. However, when you return we can consult what will be best. I am certain that if he does not get so much good, he gets less harm, and I have always thought it of very great importance that children should, in the early part of life, be unaccustomed to such examples as would tend to corrupt the purity of their words and actions, that they may chill with horror at the sound of an oath, and blush with indignation at an obscene expression. These first principles, which grow with their growth, and strengthen with their strength, neither time nor custom can totally eradicate. You will perhaps be tired. No, let it serve by way of relaxation from the more important concerns of the day, and be such an amusement as your little hermitage used to afford you here. You have before you to express myself in the words of the Bishop, the greatest national concerns that ever came before any people. And if the prayers and petitions ascend unto heaven, which are daily offered for you, wisdom will flow down as a stream, and righteousness as the mighty waters, and your deliberations will make glad the cities of our God. I was very sorry I did not know of Mr. Carey's going. It would have been so good an opportunity to have sent this as I lament the loss of. You have heard, no doubt, of the people's preventing the court from sitting in various counties, and last week in Taunton, Angier urged the court's opening and calling out the actions, but could not effect it. I saw a letter from Miss Eunice wherein she gives an account of it, and says there were 2,000 men assembled round the courthouse, and by a committee of 9 presented a petition requesting that they would not sit, and with the utmost order waited 2 hours for their answer, when they dispersed. You will burn all these letters, lest they should fall from your pocket, and thus expose your most affectionate friend, Abigail Adams. Boston Garrison, 22 September, 1774. To John Adams. I have just returned from a visit to my brother with my father, who carried me there the day before yesterday, and called here on my return to see this much injured town. I view it with much the same sensations that I should the body of a departed friend, as having only put off its present glory to rise finally to a more happy state. I will not despair, but will believe that our cause being good, we shall finally prevail. The maxim, in time of peace prepare for war, if this may be called a time of peace, resounds throughout the country. Next Tuesday they are warned at Braintree, all above 15 and under 60, to attend with their arms, and to train once a fortnight from that time is a scheme which lies much at heart with many. Scott has arrived and brings news that he expected to find all peace and quietness here as he left them at home. You will have more particulars than I am able to send you from much better hands. There has been in town a conspiracy of the negroes. At present it is kept pretty private, and was discovered by one who endeavored to dissuade them from it. He, being threatened with his life, applied to Justice Quincy for protection. They conducted in this way: got an Irishman to draw up a petition to the governor, telling him they would fight for him provided he would arm them and engage to liberate them if he conquered. And it is said that he attended so much to it as to consult Percy upon it, and one Lieutenant Small has been very busy and active. There is but little said, and what steps they will take in consequence of it I know not. I wish most sincerely there was not a slave in the province. It always appeared a most iniquitous scheme to me to fight ourselves for what we are daily robbing and plundering from those who have as good a right to freedom as we have. You know my mind upon this subject. I left all our little ones well, and shall return to them tonight. I hope to hear from you by the return of the bearer of this, and by Revere. I long for the day of your return, yet look upon you as much safer where you are, but know it will not do for you. Not one action has been brought to this court, no business of any sort in your way. All law ceases, and the gospel will soon follow, for they are supporters of each other. Adieu, my father hurries me. Yours most sincerely, Abigail Adams. Braintree, 16 October, 1774. To John Adams. My much loved friend, I dare not express to you, at 300 miles distance, how ardently I long for your return. I have some very miserly wishes, and cannot consent to your spending 1 hour in town till at least I have had you 12. The idea plays about my heart, unnerves my hand whilst I write, awakens all the tender sentiments that years have increased and matured, and which, when with me, were every day dispensing to you. The whole collected stock of 10 weeks' absence knows not how to brook any longer restraint, but will break forth and flow through my pen. May the like sensations enter thy breast, and, spite of all the weighty cares of state, mingle themselves with those I wish to communicate, for, in giving them utterance, I have felt more sincere pleasure than I have known since the 10th of August. Note the day on which he left her. Many have been the anxious hours I have spent since that day. The threatening aspect of our public affairs, the complicated distress of this province, the arduous and perplexed business in which you are engaged, have all conspired to agitate my bosom with fears and apprehensions, to which I have heretofore been a stranger, and far from thinking the scene closed, it looks as though the curtain was but just drawn, and only the first scene of the infernal plot disclosed, and whether the end will be tragical, Heaven alone knows. You cannot be, I know, nor do I wish to see you an inactive spectator, but if the sword be drawn, I bid adieu to all domestic felicity, and look forward to that country where there are neither wars nor rumors of war, in a firm belief that, through the mercy of its King, we shall both rejoice there together. I greatly fear that the arm of treachery and violence is lifted over us as a scourge and heavy punishment from Heaven for our numerous offences, and for the misimprovement of our great advantages. If we expect to inherit the blessings of our fathers, we should return a little more to their primitive simplicity of manners, and not sink into inglorious ease. We have too many high-sounding words and too few actions that correspond with them. I have spent 1 Sabbath in town since you left. I saw no difference in respect to ornament, etc., but in the country you must look for that virtue, of which you find but small glimmerings in the metropolis. Indeed, they have not the advantages nor the resolution to encourage our own manufactories, which people in the country have. To the mercantile part it is considered as throwing away their own bread, but they must retrench their expenses, and be content with a small share of gain, for they will find but few who will wear their livery. As for me, I will seek wool and flax, and work willingly with my hands, and indeed there is occasion for all our industry and economy. You mention the removal of our books, etc., from Boston. I believe they are safe there, and it would incommode the gentlemen to remove them, as they would not then have a place to repair to for study. I suppose they would not choose to be at the expense of boarding out. Mr. Williams, I believe, keeps pretty much with his mother. Mr. Hill's father had some thoughts of removing up to Braintree, provided he could be accommodated with a house, which he finds very difficult. Mr. Cranch's last determination was to tarry in town unless anything new takes place. His friends in town oppose his removal so much that he is determined to stay. The opinion you have entertained of General Gage is, I believe, just. Indeed, he professes to act only upon the defensive. The people in the country begin to be very anxious for the Congress to rise. They have no idea of the weighty business you have to transact, and their blood boils with indignation at the hostile preparations they are constant witnesses of. Mr. Quincy's so secret departure is matter of various speculation. Some say he is deputed by the Congress, others that he is gone to Holland, and the Tories say he is gone to be hanged. I rejoice at the favorable account you gave me of your health. May it be continued to you. My health is much better than it was last fall. Some folks say I grow very fat. I venture to write almost anything in this letter, because I know the care of the bearer. He will be most sadly disappointed if you should be broken up before he arrives, as he is very desirous of being introduced by you to a number of gentlemen of respectable character. I almost envy him that he should see you before I can. Mr. Thaxter and Mr. Rice present their regards to you. Uncle Quincy, too, sends his love to you. He is very good to call and see me, and so have many other of my friends been. Colonel Warren and lady were here on Monday, and send their love to you. The Colonel promised to write. Mrs. Warren will spend a day or two on her return with me. I told Betsy to write to you. She says she would, if you were her husband. Your mother sends her love to you, and all your family, too numerous to name, desire to be remembered. You will receive letters from two, who are as earnest to write to papa as if the welfare of a kingdom depended upon it. If you can give any guess within a month, let me know when you think of returning. Your most affectionate, Abigail Adams. End of Section 4. Section 5 of Letters of Mrs. Adams, Volume 1, by Charles Francis Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sue Anderson. Section 5, The Memoir, Part 3, 1775. The second meeting of the Congress, which took place in May, 1775, was marked by events which wholly changed the nature of its deliberations. Up to that period the struggle had been only a dispute. It then took the more fearful shape of a war. Mr. Adams left his house and family at Braintree on the 14th of April, only 5 days before the memorable incident at Lexington, which was a signal for the final appeal to arms. The news of the affair reached him at Hartford on his way to Philadelphia. General Gage had planned his attack upon Lexington with the knowledge that John Hancock and Samuel Adams, two of the delegates to the General Congress, were in that place at the time, and it was probably one of his objects to seize them if they could be found. Gordon, the historian, attributes their escape only to a friendly warning given them by a woman residing in Boston, but unequally yoked in politics. There was nearly the same reason for apprehension on the part of John Adams. His house was situated still nearer to Boston, could be more easily approached by water, and his family, if not he himself, was known to be residing there. Under these circumstances, what the feelings of Mrs. Adams, left with the care of 4 small children, the eldest not 10 years of age, must have been, may readily be conceived. But the letters in which she describes them bring the idea home to the mind with still greater force. She tells us that, upon the separation from her husband, her heart had felt like a heart of lead, and that she never trusts herself long with the terrors that sometimes intrude themselves upon her, that, since the never-to-be-forgotten day of his departure, the 14th of April, nothing had agitated her so much as the news of the arrival of recruits, and that she lives in continual expectation of alarms. Neither were these apprehensions altogether groundless. The letter of the 4th of May mentions that Colonel Quincy's family, whose residence was nearer to the waterside than hers, had taken refuge for one night with her. That of the 24th gives a highly vivid picture of the consternation into which the whole town was thrown by a party of British foraging upon an island in the harbor close upon the town. Then follow the account of the battle on Bunker's Hill and the burning of Charlestown, dreadful events to those in the immediate vicinity of Boston and to herself. Yet in the midst of them the writer adds that she is distressed but not dismayed, and that, she has been able to maintain a calmness and presence of mind, and hopes she shall let the exigency of the time be what it will. But it is superfluous to endeavour to heighten the picture given in the letters with so much distinctness. Mr. Adams seems to have been startled on the arrival of the intelligence at Hartford. Conscious, however, that his return would rather tend to add to than diminish the hazard to which his family was exposed, he contented himself with writing encouragement, and at the same time his directions in case of positive danger. "In a cause which interests the whole globe," he says, "at a time when my friends and country are in such keen distress, I am scarcely ever interrupted in the least degree by apprehensions for my personal safety. I am often concerned for you and our dear babes, surrounded as you are by people who are too timorous and too much susceptible of alarms. Many fears and jealousies and imaginary evils will be suggested to you, but I hope you will not be impressed by them. In case of real danger, of which you cannot fail to have previous intimations, fly to the woods with our children." Mr. Adams very well knew to whom he was recommending such an appalling alternative, the very idea of which would have been intolerable to many women. The trial Mrs. Adams was called to undergo, from the fears of those immediately around her, was one in addition to that caused by her own apprehensions; a trial, it may be remarked, of no ordinary nature, since it demands the exercise of a presence of mind and accuracy of judgment in distinguishing the false from the true, that falls to the lot of few even of the stronger sex. It is the tendency of women in general to suffer quite as much anxiety from the activity of the imagination as if it was, in every instance, founded upon reasonable cause. But the sufferings of this remarkable year were not limited to the mind alone. The terrors of war were accompanied with the ravages of pestilence. Mr. Adams was at home during the period of adjournment of the Congress, which was only for the month of August, but scarcely had he crossed his threshold when the dysentery, a disease which had already signified its approach in scattering instances about the neighborhood of the besieged town of Boston where it had commenced, assumed a highly epidemic character, and marked its victims in every family. A younger brother of Mr. Adams had fallen among the earliest in the town, but it was not till his departure for Philadelphia that almost every member of his own household was seized. The letters written during the month of September, 1775, besides being exclusively personal, are too uniformly mournful in their tone to be suitable for insertion in full in the present collection. Yet it would be failing to give an accurate idea of the character of Mrs. Adams to omit a notice of them altogether. A few extracts, reserved for this personal narrative, have been thought likely to answer the purpose better than if they were submitted in full to the public eye. On the 8th of September she commences thus: "Since you left me I have passed through great distress both of body and mind, and whether greater is to be my portion, Heaven only knows. You may remember Isaac was unwell when you left from home. His disorder increased until a violent dysentery was the consequence of his complaints. There was no resting place in the house for his terrible groans. He continued in this state nearly 1 week, when his disorder abated, and we have now hopes of his recovery. 2 days after he was sick, I was seized in a violent manner. Had I known you were at Watertown, I should have sent Brackett for you. I suffered greatly between my inclination to have you return and my fear of sending, lest you should be a partaker of the common calamity. After 3 days an abatement of my disease relieved me from that anxiety. The next person in the same week was Susie. Her we carried home, and hope she will not be very bad. Our little Tommy was the next, and he lies very ill now. Yesterday Patty was seized. Our house is a hospital in every part, and what with my own weakness and distress of mind for my family, I have been unhappy enough. And such is the distress of the neighborhood that I can scarcely find a well person to assist me in looking after the sick. On the 16th, after saying that her letter will be only a bill of mortality, and that, of all the members of her household, only one had escaped the disorder, she says, "The dread upon the minds of people of catching the distemper is almost as great as if it was the smallpox. I have been distressed more than ever I was in my life, to procure watchers and to get assistance. We have been 4 Sabbaths without any meeting. Thus does pestilence travel in the rear of war, to remind us of our entire dependence upon that Being who not only directeth the arrow by day, but has also at his command the pestilence which walketh in darkness." So uncertain and so transitory are all the enjoyments of life, that, were it not for the tender connections which bind us, would it not be a folly to wish for a continuance here? On the 25th she mentions the illness of her mother. "I sit down with a heavy heart to write you. I have had no other since you left me. Woe follows woe, and one affliction treads upon the heels of another. My distress in my own family having in some measure abated, it is excited anew upon that of my dear mother. Her kindness brought her to see me every day when I was ill, and our little Thomas. She has taken the disorder, and lies so bad that we have little hope of her recovery." On the 29th, "It is allotted me to go from the sick and almost dying bed of one of the best of parents to my own habitation, where again I behold the same scene, only varied by a remoter connection. A bitter change, severer for severe. You can more easily conceive than I describe what are the sensations of my heart when absent from either, continually expecting a messenger with the fatal tidings." Then follows the letter of the 1st of October, which, as making the climax of her distress, is inserted at length in this volume. The following week Patty, the female domestic mentioned as the other sick person, also died, after which there appears to have been no return of the disease. But among all the trying scenes of the War of the Revolution, it is doubtful whether any much exceeded this. "The desolation of war is not so distressing," she writes, "as the havoc made by the pestilence. Some poor parents are mourning the loss of 3, 4, or 5 children, and some families are wholly stripped of every member." Such as these are the kinds of trial of which history takes little or no note, yet in which female fortitude is most severely exercised. Without designing to detract from the unquestioned merit of that instrument, it must nevertheless be affirmed that the Declaration of Independence, called by the celebrated John Randolph a fanfaronade of abstractions, might very naturally be expected to reward the efforts of its signers with a crown of immortality, whilst the large share of the cost of maintaining it, wrung from the bleeding hearts of the women of the Revolution, was paid without any hope or expectation of a similar compensation. End of section 5. Section 6 of Letters of Mrs. Adams, Volume 1, by Charles Francis Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sue Anderson. Section 6, The Letters, 1775, Part 1. Braintree, 4 May, 1775. To John Adams. I have but little news to write you. Everything of that kind you will learn by a more accurate hand than mine. Things remain in much the same situation here that they were when you went away. There has been no descent upon the sea coast. Guards are regularly kept, and people seem more settled, and are returning to their husbandry. I feel somewhat lonely. Mr. Thaxter is gone home. Mr. Rice is going into the army as captain of a company. We have no school. I know not what to do with John. As government is assumed, I suppose courts of justice will be established, and in that case there may be business to do. If so, would it not be best for Mr. Thaxter to return? They seem to be discouraged in the study of law, and think there never will be any business for them. I could have wished they had consulted you upon the subject before you went away. I suppose you will receive 2 or 3 volumes of that forlorn wretch Hutcheson's letters. Among many other things, I hear he wrote in 1772 that Deacon Phillips and you had like to have been chosen into the council, but if you had, you should have shared the same fate with Bowers. May the fate of Mordecai be his. There is nobody admitted into town yet. I have made 2 or 3 attempts to get somebody in, but cannot succeed, so have not been able to do the business you left in charge with me. I want very much to hear from you, how you stood your journey, and in what state you find yourself now. I felt very anxious about you, though I endeavored to be very sensible and heroic, yet my heart felt like a heart of lead. The same night you left me I heard of Mr. Quincy's death, which at this time was a most melancholy event, especially as he wrote in minutes, which he left behind, that he had matters of consequence entrusted with him, which for want of a confidant must die with him. I went to see his distressed widow last Saturday at the Colonel's, and in the afternoon, from an alarm they had, she and her sister, with 3 others of the family, took refuge with me and tarried all night. She desired me to present her regards to you, and let you know she wished you every blessing, should always esteem you as a sincere friend of her deceased husband. Poor afflicted woman! My heart was wounded for her. I must quit the subject and entreat you to write me by every opportunity. Yours, Portia. Braintree, 7 May, 1775. To John Adams. I received by the Deacon 2 letters from you this day, from Hartford. I feel a recruit of spirits upon the reception of them, and the comfortable news which they contain. We had not heard anything from North Carolina before, and could not help feeling anxious, lest we should find a defection there, arising more from their ancient feuds and animosities than from any settled ill will in the present contest. But the confirmation of the choice of their delegates by their Assembly leaves not a doubt of their firmness, nor doth the eye say unto the hand, I have no need of thee. The Lord will not cast off his people, neither will he forsake his inheritance. Great events are most certainly in the womb of futurity, and if the present chastisements which we experience have a proper influence upon our conduct, the event will certainly be in our favor. The distresses of the inhabitants of Boston are beyond the power of language to describe. There are but very few who are permitted to come out in a day. They delay giving passes, make them wait from hour to hour, and their counsels are not 2 hours together alike. One day they shall come out with their effects. The next day merchandise is not effects. One day their household furniture is to come out, the next only wearing apparel, the next Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and he refuseth to hearken to them, and will not let the people go. May their deliverance be wrought out for them as it was for the children of Israel. I do not mean by miracles, but by the interposition of heaven in their favor. They have taken a list of all those who they suppose were concerned in watching the tea, and every other person whom they call obnoxious, and they and their effects are to suffer destruction. Yours, Portia. Braintree, 24 May, 1775. To John Adams: I suppose you have had a formidable account of the alarm we had last Sunday morning. When I rose about 6 o'clock I was told that the drums had been some time beating, and that 3 alarm guns were fired, that Weymouth bell had been ringing, and Mr. Weld's was then ringing. I immediately sent off an express to know the occasion, and found the whole town in confusion. 3 sloops and 1 cutter had come out and dropped anchor just below Great Hill. It was difficult to tell their designs. Some supposed they were coming to Germantown, others to Weymouth. People, women, children from the ironworks came flocking down this way, every woman and child driven off from below my father's family flying. The doctor is in great distress, as you may well imagine, for my aunt had her bed thrown into a cart into which she got herself, and ordered the boy to drive her to Bridgewater, which he did. The report was to them that 300 had landed, and were upon their march up into the town. The alarm flew like lightning, and men from all parts came flocking down, till 2,000 were collected. But it seems their expedition was to Grape Island for Levitt's hay. There it was impossible to reach them for want of boats, but the sight of so many persons and the firing at them prevented their getting more than 3 tons of hay, though they had carted much more down to the water. At last a lighter was mustered, and a sloop from Hingham which had 6 portholes. Our men eagerly jumped on board and put off for the island. As soon as they perceived it, they decamped. Our people landed upon the island, and in an instant set fire to the hay, which, with the barn, was soon consumed. About 80 tons, it is said. We expect soon to be in continual alarms till something decisive takes place. We wait with longing expectation, in hopes to hear the best accounts from you with regard to union and harmony, etc. We rejoice greatly on the arrival of Dr. Frankland, as he must certainly be able to inform you very particularly of the situation of affairs in England. I wish you would, if you can get time, be as particular as you may when you write. Everyone hereabouts comes to me to hear what accounts I have. I was so unlucky as not to get the letter you wrote at New York. Captain Beale forgot it and left it behind. We have a flying report here with regard to New York, but cannot give any credit to it as yet, that they had been engaged with the ships which Gage sent there, and had taken them with great loss upon both sides. Yesterday we had an account of 3 ships coming into Boston. I believe it is true, as there was a salute from the other ships, though I have not been able to learn from whence they come. I suppose you have had an account of the fire, which did much damage to the warehouses, and added greatly to the distresses of the inhabitants whilst it continued. The bad conduct of General Gage was the means of its doing so much damage. Our house has been, upon this alarm, in the same scene of confusion that it was upon the former. Soldiers coming in for a lodging, for breakfast, for supper, for drink, etc. Sometimes refugees from Boston, tired and fatigued, seek an asylum for a day, a night, a week. You can hardly imagine how we live. Yet to the houseless child of want our doors are open still, and though our portions are but scant, we give them with good will. My best wishes attend you, both for your health and happiness, and that you may be directed into the wisest and best measures for our safety, and the security of our posterity. I wish you were nearer to us. We know not what a day will bring forth, nor what distress one hour may throw us into. Hitherto I have been able to maintain a calmness and presence of mind, and hope I shall, let the exigency of the time be what it will. Adieu. Breakfast calls. Your affectionate Portia. Weymouth, 15 June, 1775. To John Adams. I sat down to write you on Monday, but really could not compose myself sufficiently. The anxiety I suffered from not hearing one syllable from you for more than 5 weeks, and the new distress arising from the arrival of recruits, agitated me more than I have been since the never to be forgotten 14th of April, note the day upon which he left her. I have been much revived by receiving 2 letters from you last night, one by the servant of your friend, and the other by the gentleman you mention, though they both went to Cambridge, and I have not seen them. I hope to send this as a return to you. I feared much for your health when you went away. I must entreat you to be as careful as you can, consistently with the duty you owe your country. That consideration alone prevailed with me to consent to your departure, in a time so perilous and so hazardous to your family, and with a body so infirm as to require the tenderest care and nursing. I wish you may be supported and divinely assisted in this most important crisis, when the fate of empires depends upon your wisdom and conduct. I greatly rejoice to hear of your union and determination to stand by us. We cannot but consider the great distance you are from us as a very great misfortune, when our critical situation renders it necessary to hear from you every week, and will be more and more so as difficulties arise. We now expect our seacoast ravaged. Perhaps the very next letter I write will inform you that I am driven away from our yet quiet cottage. Necessity will oblige Gage to take some desperate steps. We are told for truth that he is now 8,000 strong. We live in continual expectation of alarms. Courage I know we have in abundance. Conduct I hope we shall not want. But powder, where shall we get a sufficient supply? I wish we may not fail there. Every town is filled with the distressed inhabitants of Boston. Our house among others is deserted, and by this time like enough made use of as a barrack. Mr. Bedoin and his lady are at present in the house of Mrs. Borland, and are going to Middleborough to the house of Judge Oliver. He, poor gentleman, is so low that I apprehend he is hastening to a house not made with hands. He looks like a mere skeleton, speaks faint and low, is racked with a violent cough, and, I think, far advanced in consumption. I went to see him last Saturday. He is very inquisitive of every person with regard to the times, begged I would let him know of the first intelligence I had from you, is very unable to converse by reason of his cough. He rides every pleasant day, and has been kind enough to call at the door, though unable to get out, several times. He says the very name of Hutcheson distresses him. Speaking of him the other day, he broke out, "Religious rascal! How I abhor his name!" Pray be as particular as possible when you write. Everybody wants to hear and to know what is doing, and what may be communicated do not fail to inform me of. All our friends desire to be kindly remembered to you. Gage's proclamation you will receive by this conveyance. All the records of time cannot produce a blacker page. Satan, when driven from the regions of bliss, exhibited not more malice. Surely the father of lies is superseded. Yet we think it the best proclamation he could have issued. I shall, whenever I can, receive and entertain, in the best manner I am capable, the gentlemen who have so generously proffered their services in our army. Government is wanted in the army and elsewhere. We see the want of it more from so large a body being together than when each individual was employed in his own domestic circle. My best regards to every man you esteem. You will make my compliments to Mr. Mifflin and lady. I do not now wonder at the regard the ladies express for a soldier. Every man who wears a cockade appears of double the importance he used to do, and I feel a respect for the lowest subaltern in the army. You tell me you know not when you shall see me. I never trust myself long with the terrors which sometimes intrude themselves upon me. I hope we shall see each other again, and rejoice together in happier days. The little ones are well, and send duty to papa. Don't fail of letting me hear from you by every opportunity. Every line is like a precious relic of the saints. I have a request to make of you, something like the barrel of sand, I suppose you will think it, but really of much more importance to me. It is that you would send out Mr. Bass and purchase me a bundle of pins and put them in your trunk for me. The cry for pins is so great that what I used to buy for 7 shillings and 6 are now 20 shillings and not to be had for that. A bundle contains 6,000, for which I used to give $1, but if you can procure them for 50 shillings or £3, pray let me have them. I am, with the tenderest regard, your Portia. Sunday, 18 June, 1775. To John Adams. Dearest friend, the day, perhaps the decisive day, is come on which the fate of America depends. My bursting heart must find vent at my pen. I have just heard that our dear friend, Dr. Warren, is no more, but fell gloriously fighting for his country, saying better to die honorably in the field than ignominiously hang upon the gallows. Great is our loss. He has distinguished himself in every engagement by his courage and fortitude, by animating the soldiers and leading them on by his own example. A particular account of these dreadful, but I hope glorious days, will be transmitted you, no doubt, in the exactest manner. The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, but the God of Israel is he that giveth strength and power unto his people. Trust in him at all times, ye people. Pour out your hearts before him. God is a refuge for us. Charlestown is laid in ashes. The battle began upon our entrenchments upon Bunker's Hill Saturday morning about 3 o'clock, and has not ceased yet, and it is now 3 o'clock Sabbath afternoon. It is expected they will come out over the neck tonight, and a dreadful battle must ensue. Almighty God, cover the heads of our countrymen, and be a shield to our dear friends. How many have fallen we know not. The constant roar of the cannon is so distressing that we cannot eat, drink, or sleep. May we be supported and sustained in the dreadful conflict. I shall tarry here until it is thought unsafe by my friends, and then I have secured myself a retreat at your brother's, who has kindly offered me part of his house. I cannot compose myself to write any further at present. I will add more as I hear further. Tuesday afternoon. I have been so much agitated that I have not been able to write since Sabbath day. When I say that 10,000 reports are passing, vague and uncertain as the wind, I believe I speak the truth. I am not able to give you any authentic account of last Saturday, but you will not be destitute of intelligence. Colonel Palmer has just sent me word that he has an opportunity of conveyance. Incorrect as this scrawl will be, it shall go. I ardently pray that you may be supported through the arduous task you have before you. I wish I could contradict the report of the doctor's death, but it is a lamentable truth, and the tears of multitudes pay tribute to his memory. Those favorite lines of Collins continually sound in my ears. How sleep the brave, etc. I must close, as the deacon waits. I have not pretended to be particular with regard to what I have heard, because I know you will collect better intelligence. The spirits of the people are very good. The loss of Charlestown affects them no more than a drop of the bucket. I am most sincerely yours, Portia. 22 June, 1775. To John Adams. I received yours of June 10th, for which I thank you. I want you to be more particular. Does every member feel for us? Can they realize what we suffer? And can they believe with what patience and fortitude we endure the conflict? Nor do we even tremble at the frowns of power. You inquire of me who were at the engagement at Grape Island. I may say with truth all of Weymouth, Braintree, Higham, who were able to bear arms, and hundreds from other towns within 20, 30, and 40 miles of Weymouth. Our good friend the doctor is in a miserable state of health, and hardly able to go from his own house to my father's. Danger, you know, sometimes makes timid men bold. He stood that day very well, and generously attended, with drink, biscuit, flints, etc., 500 men without taking any pay. He has since been chosen one of the Committee of Correspondence for that town, and has done much service by establishing a regular method of alarm from town to town. Both your brothers were there, your younger brother with his company, who gained honor by their good order that day. He was one of the first to venture on board a schooner to land upon the island. As to Chelsea, I cannot be so particular, as I know only in general that Colonel Putman commanded there, and had many gentlemen volunteers. We have 2 companies stationed in this town: at Germantown, Captain Turner; at Squantum, Captain Vinton; in Weymouth, 1; in Hingham, 2, etc. I believe I shall remove your books this week to your brothers. We think it advisable. Colonel Quincy has procured his family a retreat at Deacon Holbrook's. Mr. Cranch has one at Major Bass's, in case of necessity, to which we hope not to be driven. We hear that the troops destined for New York are all expected here, but we have got to that pass that a whole legion of them would not intimidate us. I think I am very brave, upon the whole. If danger comes near my dwelling, I suppose I shall shudder. We want powder, but with the blessing of Heaven we fear them not. Write every opportunity you can. I am yours, Portia. End of Section 6. Section 7 of Letters of Mrs. Adams, Volume 1, by Charles Francis Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sue Anderson. Section 7, The Letters, 1775, Part 2. Braintree, 25 June, 1775. To John Adams. Dearest friend, my father has been more afflicted by the destruction of Charlestown than by anything which has heretofore taken place. Why should not his countenance be sad, when the city, the place of his father's sepulchre, lieth waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire? Scarcely one stone remaineth upon another. But in the midst of sorrow we have abundant cause of thankfulness that so few of our brethren were numbered with the slain, whilst our enemies were cut down like the grass before the scythe. But one officer of all the Welsh Fusiliers remains to tell his story. Many poor wretches die for want of proper assistance and care of their wounds. Every account agrees in 14 or 1500 slain and wounded upon their side, nor can I learn that they dissemble the number themselves. We had some heroes that day, who fought with amazing intrepidity and courage. Extremity is the trier of spirits. Common chances common men can bear, and when the sea is calm, all boats alike show mastership in floating. But fortune's blows, when most struck home, being bravely warded, crave a noble cunning. I hear that General Howe has said that the battle upon the plains of Abram was but a bauble to this. When we consider all the circumstances attending this action, we stand astonished that our people were not all cut off. They had but 100 feet entrenched, The number who were engaged did not exceed 800, and they with not half ammunition enough, the reinforcement not able to get to them seasonably. The tide was up and high, so that their floating batteries came upon each side of the causeway, and their row galleys kept a continual fire. Added to this, the fire from Copp's Hill and from the ships, the town in flames all around them, and the heat from the flames so intense as scarcely to be borne, the day one of the hottest we have had this season, and the wind blowing the smoke in their faces. Only figure to yourself all these circumstances, and then consider that we do not count 60 men lost. My heart overflows at the recollection. We live in continual expectation of hostilities, scarcely a day that does not produce some. But like good Nehemiah, having made our prayer unto God, and set the people with their swords, their spears, and their bows, we will say unto them, Be not ye afraid of them, remember the Lord, who is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your houses. I have just received yours of the 17th of June, in 7 days only. Every line from that far country is precious. You do not tell me how you do, but I will hope better. Alas, you little thought what distress we were in the day you wrote. They delight in molesting us upon the Sabbath. 2 Sabbaths we have been in such alarm that we have had no meeting. This day we have sat under our own vine in quietness. Have heard Mr. Taft from Psalms, The Lord is good to all, and his tender mercies are over all his works. The good man was earnest and pathetic. I could forgive his weakness for the sake of his sincerity, but I long for a Cooper and an Eliot. I want a person who has feeling and sensibility, who can take one up with him, and in his duty, prompt at every call, can watch and weep and pray and feel for all. Mr. Rice joins General Heath's regiment tomorrow as adjutant. Your brother is very desirous of being in the army, but your good mother is really violent against it. I cannot persuade nor reason her into a consent. Neither he nor I dare let her know that he is trying for a place. My brother has a captain's commission and is stationed at Cambridge. I thought you had the best of intelligence, or I should have taken pains to be more particular. As to Boston, there are many persons yet there who would be glad to get out if they could. Mr. Boylston and Mr. Gill, the printer, with his family, are held upon the blacklist, it is said. 'Tis certain they watch them so narrowly that they cannot escape. Mr. Mather got out a day or two before Charlestown was destroyed, and had lodged his papers and what else he got out at Mr. Carey's, but they were all consumed. So were many other people's, who thought they might trust their little there till teams could be procured to remove them. The people from the almshouse and workhouse were sent to the lines last week, to make room for their wounded, they say. Medford people are all removed. Every seaport seems in motion. O North, may the groans and cries of the injured and oppressed harrow up thy soul. We have a prodigious army, but we lack many accommodations, which we need. I hope the appointment of these new generals will give satisfaction. They must be proof against calumny. In a contest like this, continual reports are circulated by our enemies, and they catch with the unwary and the gaping crowd, who are ready to listen to the marvelous without considering of consequences, even though their best friends are injured. I have not ventured to inquire one word of you about your return. I do not know whether I ought to wish for it. It seems as if your sitting together was absolutely necessary, whilst every day is big with events. Mr. Bedoin called Friday and took his leave of me, desiring I would present his affectionate regards to you. I have hopes that he will recover. He has mended a good deal. He wished he could have stayed in Braintree, but his lady was fearful. Yours evermore, Portia. Braintree, 5 July, 1775. To John Adams. I have received a good deal of paper from you. I wish it had been more covered. The writing is very scant. Yet I must not grumble. I know your time is not yours nor mine. Your labors must be great and your mouth closed. But all you may communicate I beg you would. There is a pleasure, I know not whence it arises, nor can I stop now to find it out, but I say there is a degree of pleasure in being able to tell news, especially any that so nearly concerns us as all your proceedings do. I should have been more particular, but I thought you knew everything that passed here. The present state of the inhabitants of Boston is that of the most abject slaves, under the most cruel and despotic of tyrants. Among many instances I could mention, let me relate one. Upon the 17th of June, printed handbills were posted up at the corners of the streets and upon houses, forbidding any inhabitants to go upon their houses or upon any eminence, on pain of death. The inhabitants dared not to look out of their houses, nor to be heard or seen to ask a question. Our prisoners were brought over to the Long Wharf, and there lay all night without any care of their wounds, or any resting place but the pavements, until the next day, when they exchanged it for the jail, since which we hear they are civilly treated. Their living cannot be good, as they can have no fresh provisions. Their beef, we hear, is all gone, and their own wounded men die very fast, so that they have a report that the bullets were poisoned. Fish they cannot have. They have rendered it so difficult to procure, and the admiral is such a villain as to oblige every fishing schooner to pay $1 every time it goes out. The money that has been paid for passes is incredible. Some have given $10, $20, $30, and $40 to get out with a small proportion of their things. It is reported and believed that they have taken up a number of persons and committed them to jail, we know not for what in particular. Master Lovell is confined in the dungeon. A son of Mr. Eady's is in jail, and one Wybert, a ship carpenter, is now upon trial for his life. God alone knows to what length these wretches will go, and will, I hope, restrain their malice. I would not have you be distressed about me. Danger, they say, makes people valiant. Hitherto I have been distressed, but not dismayed. I have felt for my country and her sons, and have bled with them and for them. Not all the havoc and devastation they have made has wounded me like the death of Warren. We want him in the Senate. We want him in his profession. We want him in the field. We mourn for the citizen, the senator, the physician, and the warrior. May we have others raised up in his room. I have had a very kind and friendly visit from our dear friends Colonel Warren, lady, and son. Mrs. Warren spent almost a week with me, and he came and met her here, and kept Sabbath with me. I suppose she will write to you, though she says you are in her debt. You scarcely make mention of Dr. Frankland. Surely he must be a valuable member. Pray, what is become of your Judas? I see he is not with you upon the list of delegates. I wish I could come and see you. I never suffer myself to think you are about returning soon. Can it? Will it be? May I ask? May I wish for it? When once I expect you, the time will crawl till I see you. But hush, do you know it is 11 o'clock at night? We have had some very fine rain since I wrote you last. I hope we shall not now have famine added to war. Grain, grain is what we want here. Meat we have enough and to spare. Pray don't let Bass forget my pins. Hardwick has applied to me for Mr. Bass to get him 100 of needles, number 6, to carry on his stocking weaving. We shall very soon have no coffee, nor sugar, nor pepper here, but whortleberries and milk we are not obliged to commerce for. Good night. With thoughts of thee do I close my eyes. Angels guard and protect thee, and may a safe return ere long bless thy Portia. Braintree, 16 July, 1775. To John Adams. Dearest friend, I have seen your letters to Colonels Palmer and Warren. I pity your embarrassments. How difficult the task to quench the fire and pride of private ambition, and to sacrifice ourselves and all our hopes and expectations to the public weal. How few have souls capable of so noble an undertaking! How often are the laurels worn by those who have had no share in earning them! But there is a future recompense of reward, to which the upright man looks, and which he will most assuredly obtain, provided he perseveres unto the end. The appointment of the Generals Washington and Lee gives universal satisfaction. The people have the highest opinion of Lee's abilities, but you know the continuation of the popular breath depends much upon favorable events. I had the pleasure of seeing both the generals and their aides de camp soon after their arrival, and of being personally made known to them. They very politely expressed their regard for you. Major Mifflin said he had orders from you to visit me at Braintree. I told him I should be very happy to see him there, and accordingly sent Mr. Thaxter to Cambridge with a card to him and Mr. Reed to dine with me. Mrs. Warren and her son were to be with me. They very politely received the message, and lamented that they were not able to come, upon account of expresses which they were on that day to get in readiness to send off. I was struck with General Washington. You had prepared me to entertain a favorable opinion of him, but I thought the half was not told me. Dignity with ease and complacency, the gentleman and soldier, look agreeably blended in him. Modesty marks every line and feature of his face. Those lines of Dryden instantly occurred to me. Mark his majestic fabric, he's a temple, sacred by birth and built by hands divine. His soul's the deity that lodges there, nor is the pile unworthy of the god. General Lee looks like a careless, hardy veteran, and by his appearance brought to my mind his namesake, Charles XII. Of Sweden. The elegance of his pen far exceeds that of his person. You have made frequent complaints that your friends do not write to you. I have stirred up some of them. May not I in my turn make complaints? All the letters I receive from you seem to be written in so much haste that they scarcely leave room for a social feeling. They let me know that you exist, but some of them contain scarcely 6 lines. I want some sentimental effusions of the heart. I am sure you are not destitute of them, or are they all absorbed in the great public? Much is due to that, I know, but being part of the public, I lay claim to a larger share than I have had. You used to be more communicative on Sundays. I always loved a Sabbath day letter, for then you had a greater command of your time. But hush to all complaints. I am much surprised that you have not been more accurately informed of what passes in the camps. As to intelligence from Boston, it is but very seldom we are able to collect anything that may be relied on, and to report the vague, flying rumors would be endless. I heard yesterday by one Mr. Rolston, a goldsmith, who got out in a fishing schooner, that their distress increased upon them fast. Their beef is all spent. their malt and cider all gone. All the fresh provisions they can procure they are obliged to give to the sick and wounded. 13 of our men who were in jail and were wounded at the battle of Charlestown were dead. No man dared now to be seen talking to his friend in the street. They were obliged to be within every evening at 10 o'clock, according to martial law, nor could any inhabitant walk any street in town after that time without a pass from Gage. He has ordered all the molasses to be distilled up into rum for the soldiers, taken away all licenses and given out others, obliging to a forfeiture of 10 pounds if any rum is sold without written orders from the general. He gives much the same account of the killed and wounded we have from others. The spirit, he says, which prevails among the soldiers is a spirit of malice and revenge. There is no true courage and bravery to be observed among them. Their duty is hard, always mounting guard with their packs at their backs, ready for an alarm, which they live in continual hazard of. Dr. Elliott is not on board a man of war, as has been reported, but perhaps was left in town as the comfort and support of those who cannot escape. He was constantly with our prisoners. Messrs. Lovell and Leach with others are certainly in jail. A poor milch cow was last week killed in town, and sold for a shilling sterling per pound. The transports arrived last week from York, but every additional man adds to their distress. There has been a little expedition this week to Long Island, in Boston Harbor. There have been before several attempts to go on, but 3 men of war lay near, and cutters all round the island, so that they could not succeed. A number of whale boats lay at Germantown. 300 volunteers, commanded by one Captain Tupper, came on Monday evening and took the boats, went on, and brought off 70 odd sheep, 15 head of cattle, and 16 prisoners, 13 of whom were sent, by simple sapling, to mow the hay, which they had very badly executed. They were all asleep in the house and barn. When they were taken, there were 3 women with them. Our heroes came off in triumph, not being observed by their enemies. This spirited up others, who could not endure the thought that the house and barn should afford them any shelter. They did not destroy them the night before for fear of being discovered. Captain Wild of this town, with about 25 of his company, Captain Gold of Weymouth with as many of his, and some other volunteers, to the amount of 100, obtained leave to go on and destroy the hay together with the house and barn, and in open day, in full view of the men of war, they set off from the Moon, so called, the name given to a small island in Boston Harbor, covered by a number of men who were placed there, went on and set fire to the buildings and hay. A number of armed cutters immediately surrounded the island and fired upon our men. They came off with a hot and continued fire upon them, the bullets flying in every direction, and the men of war's boats plying them with small arms. Many in this town who were spectators expected every moment our men would all be sacrificed, for sometimes they were so near as to be called and damned by their enemies and ordered to surrender. Yet they all returned in safety, not one man even wounded. Upon the Moon we lost 1 man from the cannon on board the man of war. On the evening of the same day a man of war came and anchored near Great Hill, and 2 cutters came to Pig Rocks. It occasioned an alarm in this town, and we were up all night. They remained there yet, but have not ventured to land any men. This town have chosen their representative. Colonel Palmer is the man. There was a considerable muster upon Thayer's side, and Vinton's company marched up in order to assist, but got sadly disappointed. Newcomb insisted upon it that no man should vote who was in the army. He had no notion of being under the military power; said we might be so situated as to have the greater part of the people engaged in the military, and then all power would be wrested out of the hands of the civil magistrate. He insisted upon its being put to a vote, and carried his point immediately. It brought Thayer to his speech, who said all he could against it. As to the situation of the camps, our men are in general healthy, much more so at Roxbury than at Cambridge, and the camp is in vastly better order. General Thomas has the character of an excellent officer. His merit has certainly been overlooked, as modest merit generally is. I hear General Washington is much pleased with his conduct. Every article here in the West India way is very scarce and dear. In 6 weeks we shall not be able to purchase any article of the kind. I wish you would let Bass get me 1 pound of pepper and 2 yards of black calamanco for shoes. I cannot wear leather if I go barefoot. Bass may make a fine profit if he lays in a stock for himself. You can hardly imagine how much we want many common small articles which are not manufactured amongst ourselves, but we will have them in time. Not 1 pin to be purchased for love or money. I wish you could convey me 1,000 by any friend traveling this way. It is very provoking to have such a plenty so near us, but, Tantalus like, not be able to touch. I should have been glad to have laid in a small stock of the West India articles, but I cannot get 1 copper. No person thinks of paying anything, and I do not choose to run into debt. We have not yet been much distressed for grain. Everything at present looks blooming. Oh, that peace would once more extend her olive branch. This day be bread and peace my lot. All else beneath the sun, Thou knowest if best bestowed or not, and let Thy will be done. But is the Almighty ever bound to please? Build by my wish or studious of my ease? Shall I determine where His frown shall fall, and fence my grotto from the lot of all? Prostrate His sovereign wisdom I adore, entreat His mercy, but I dare no more. I have now written you all I can collect from every quarter. 'Tis fit for no eyes but yours, because you can make all necessary allowances. I cannot copy. There are yet in town 3 of the selectmen and some thousands of inhabitants, 'tis said. I hope to hear from you soon. Do let me know if there is any prospect of seeing you. Next Wednesday is 13 weeks since you went away. I must bid you adieu. You have many friends, though they have not noticed you by writing. I am sorry they have been so negligent. I hope no share of that blame lies upon your most affectionate Portia. End of Section 7. Section 8 of Letters of Mrs. Adams, Volume 1, by Charles Francis Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sue Anderson. Section 8, The Letters, 1775, Part 3. Braintree, 25 July, 1775. To John Adams. Dearest Friend, I received yours of July 7th, for which I heartily thank you. It was the longest and best letter I have had, the most leisurely, and therefore the most sentimental. Previous to your last, I had written you and made some complaints of you, but I will take them all back again. Only continue your obliging favors whenever your time will allow you to devote 1 moment to your absent Portia. This is the 25th of July. Gage has not made any attempts to march out since the battle at Charlestown. Our army is restless and wish to be doing something to rid themselves and the land of the vermin and locusts which infest it. Since I wrote you last, the company stationed upon the coast, both in this town, Weymouth and Hingham, were ordered to Nantasket to reap and bring off the grain, which they accomplished, all except a field or two which was not ripe; and having whale boats, they undertook to go to the lighthouse and set fire to it, which they effected in open day, and in fair sight of several men of war. Upon their return came down upon them 8 barges, 1 cutter, and 1 schooner, all in battle array, and poured whole broadsides upon them; but our men all reached the shore, and not one life lost, 2 only slightly wounded in their legs. They marched up a hill, and drew into order, in hopes the marines would land, but they chose rather to return without a land engagement, though 'tis thought they will burn the town down as soon as our forces leave it. I had this account from Captain Vinton, who with his company were there. These little skirmishes seem trifling, but they serve to inure our men and harden them to danger. I hear the rebels are very wroth at the destruction of the lighthouse. There has been an offer from Gage to send the poor of Boston to Salem by water, but not complied with on our part. They returned for answer they would receive them upon the lines. Dr. Tufts saw a letter from Deacon Newell in which he mentions the death of John Cotton. He says it is very sickly in town. Every fishing vessel is now obliged to enter and clear out as though she was going to a foreign voyage. No inhabitant is suffered to partake, but obliged to wait till the army is supplied, and then, if one remains, they are allowed to purchase it. An order has been given out in town that no person shall be seen to wipe his face with a white handkerchief. The reason, I hear, is that it is a signal of mutiny. General Burgoyne lives in Mr. Sam Quincy's house. A lady who lived opposite says she saw raw meat cut and hacked upon her mahogany tables, and her superb damask curtain and cushions exposed to the rain as if they were of no value. How much better do the Tories fare than the Whigs! I suppose this worthy good man was put in with all confidence that nothing should be hurt. I was very much pleased with General Lee's letter, and really entertained a more favorable opinion of Burgoyne than I before had imbibed from his speech. But a late letter from London, written to Mr. Josiah Quincy, and in case of his absence, to be opened either by you or Mr. Samuel Adams, or either of the Warrens, has left me no room to think that he is possessed either of generosity, virtue, or humanity. His character runs thus: quote, "As to Burgoyne, I am not master of language sufficient to give you a true idea of the horrible wickedness of the man. His designs are dark, his dissimulation of the deepest dye, for, not content with deceiving mankind, he practices deceit on God himself by assuming the appearance, like Hutcheson, of great attention to religious worship, when every action of his life is totally abhorrent to all ideas of true religion, virtue, or common honesty. An abandoned, infamous gambler of broken fortune, and the worst and most detestable of the Bedford gang, who are wholly bent on blood, tyranny, and spoil, and therefore the darling favorite of our unrivaled ruler, Lord Bute." Note: much allowance must occasionally be made for the excitement naturally growing out of the circumstances of the war. General Burgoyne by no means bore any such character as this. The character of Howe is not drawn much more favorably, but Clinton's general character very good, and 'tis said he does not relish the service he is sent upon. I am ready to believe this of Clinton, as I have never heard of any speeches of his since his arrival, nor scarcely any mention of him. That such characters as Burgoyne and Howe should engage in such a cause is not to be wondered at, but it really is to be lamented when a man possessed of one spark of virtue should be drawn aside and disgrace himself and posterity by adding one more to the already infamous list. I suppose you have heard of Derby's arrival, and the intelligence he brings. I could not refrain wishing them everlasting fetters. "The news received with some symptoms of pleasure," and "our friends increased," and a few more such sugar plums. Were they suffering as we are? Could Americans sit thus coldly while Britons were bleeding? How is it possible that the love of gain and the lust of domination should render the human mind so callous to every principle of honor, generosity, and benevolence? May that day be far distant from America when trade's unfeeling train shall usurp this land and dispossess the swain. Ill fares the land to hastening ills a prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay. Princes and lords may flourish or may fade, a breath can make them, as a breath has made, but a bold peasantry, their country's pride, when once destroyed, can never be supplied. Your address meets with general approbation here. Your petitioning the King again pleases, forgive me if I say the timid and the weak, those persons who were esteemed the lukewarm, and who think no works of supererogation can be performed to Great Britain, whilst others say you heap coals of fire upon the heads of your enemies. You know you are considered here as a most perfect body. If one member is by any means rendered incapable of acting, 'tis supposed the deficiency will be made up. The query is, why your President left the Congress so long as to make it necessary to choose another member, whether he declined returning to you again. I suppose you have a list of our council. It was generally thought that Gage would make an attempt to come out either election day or upon the fast, but I could not believe we should be disturbed upon that day. Even the devils believe and tremble, and I really believe they are more afraid of the Americans' prayers than of their swords. I could not bear to hear our inanimate old bachelor. Mrs. Cranch and I took our chaise and went to hear Mr. Haven of Dedham, and we had no occasion to repent 11 miles' ride, especially as I had the pleasure of spending the day with my namesake and sister delegate. Note, Mrs. Samuel Adams. Why should we not assume your titles when we give you up our names? I found her comfortably situated in a little country cottage, with patience, perseverance, and fortitude for her companions, and in better health than she has enjoyed for many months past. I fear General Thomas being overlooked and Heath placed over him will create much uneasiness. I know not who was to blame, but it is likely to make a great and fatal gap in the army. If Thomas resigns, all his officers resign, and Mr. Thomas cannot with honor hold under Heath. The camp will evince to every eye how good an officer he has been, but this is out of my sphere. I only say what others say, and what the general disposition of the people is. I need not say how much I want to see you, but no one will credit my story of your returning in a month. I hope to have the best of proofs to convince them. I cannot need any to convince you how sincerely I am your affectionate Portia. Braintree, 31 July, 1775. To John Adams. I do not feel easy more than 2 days together without writing to you. If you abound, you must lay some of the fault upon yourself, who have made such sad complaints for letters. But I really believe I have written more than all my sister delegates. There is nothing new transpired since I wrote you last, but the sailing of some transports, and 5 deserters having come into our camp. One of them is gone, I hear, to Philadelphia. I think I should be cautious of him. No one can tell the secret designs of such fellows whom no oath binds. He may be sent with assassinating designs. I can credit any villainy that a Caesar Borgia would have been guilty of, or Satan himself would rejoice in. Those who do not scruple to bring poverty, misery, slavery, and death upon thousands will not hesitate at the most diabolical crimes. And this is Britain. Blush, O Americans, that ever you derived your origin from such a race. We learn from one of these deserters that our ever valued friend Warren, dear to us even in death, was not treated with any more respect than a common soldier, but the savage wretches called officers consulted together and agreed to sever his head from his body and carry it in triumph to Gage, who no doubt would have grinned horribly a ghastly smile instead of imitating Caesar, who, far from being gratified with so horrid a spectacle as the head even of his enemy, turned away from Pompey's with disgust and gave vent to his pity in a flood of tears. How much does pagan tenderness put Christian benevolence to shame! What humanity could not obtain, the rites and ceremonies of a Mason demanded. An officer, who it seems was one of the brotherhood, requested that as a Mason he might have the body unmangled and find a decent interment for it. He obtained his request, but upon returning to secure it he found it already thrown into the earth, only with the ceremony of being first placed there with many bodies over him. Nor writ his name, whose tomb should pierce the skies. Glows my resentment into guilt? What guilt can equal violations of the dead? The dead, how sacred! Sacred is the dust of this heaven-labored form, erect, divine, this heaven-assumed, majestic robe of earth. To August. Thus far I wrote and broke off. Hearing there was a probability of your return, I thought not to send it, but the reception of yours this morning of July 23rd makes me think the day further off than I hoped. I therefore will add a few lines, though very unfit. I went out yesterday to attend the funeral of the poor fellow who, the night before, fell in battle as they were returning from the lighthouse. I caught some cold. Sabbath evening there was a warm fire from Prospect Hill and Bunker's Hill, begun first by the riflemen taking off their guard. 2 men upon our side were killed, 5 of their guards were killed, 2 taken. I believe my account will be very confused, but I will relate it as well as I am able. Sabbath evening a number of men in whaleboats went off from Squantum and Dorchester to the lighthouse, where the General Gage had again fixed up a lamp, and sent 12 carpenters to repair it. Our people went on amidst a hot fire from 30 marines, who were placed there as a guard to the Tory carpenters, burnt the dwelling house, took the Tories and 28 marines, killed the lieutenant and 1 man, brought off all the oil and stores which were sent without the loss of a man, until they were upon their return, when they were so closely pursued that they were obliged to run 1 whaleboat ashore and leave her to them. The rest arrived safe, except the unhappy youth whose funeral I yesterday attended, who received a ball through the temple as he was rowing the boat. He belonged to Rhode Island. His name was Griffin. He, with 4 wounded marines, were brought by Captain Turner to Germantown, and buried from there with the honors of war. Mr. Wybird, upon the occasion, made the best oration (he never prays, you know) I ever heard from him. The poor wounded fellows, who were all wounded in their arms, desired they might attend. They did, and he very pathetically addressed them, with which they appeared affected. I spoke with them. I told them it was very unhappy that they should be obliged to fight their best friends. They said they were sorry. They hoped in God an end would be speedily put to the unhappy contest. When they came, They came in the way of their duty to relieve Admiral Montague, with no thought of fighting, but their situation was such as obliged them to obey orders. But they wished with all their souls that they that sent them here had been in the heat of the battle, expressed gratitude at the kindness they received, and said in that they had been deceived, for they were told if they were taken alive they would be sacrificed by us. Dr. Tufts dressed their wounds. I had a design to write something about a talked-of appointment of a friend of mine to a judicial department, but hope soon to see that friend before his acceptance may be necessary. Note: Mr. Adams was made Chief Justice of the State Court, but never acted in that capacity. I enclose a compliment, copied by a gentleman from a piece in the Worcester paper, signed Lycurgus. I can add no more, as the good Colonel Palmer waits. Only my compliments to Mrs. Mifflin, and tell her I do not know whether her husband is safe here. Bellona and Cupid have a contest about him. You hear nothing from the ladies but about Major Mifflin's easy address, politeness, complaisance, etc. 'Tis well he has so agreeable a lady at Philadelphia. They know nothing about forts, entrenchments, etc. when they return, or if they do, they are all forgotten and swallowed up in his accomplishments. Adieu, my dearest friend, and always believe me, unalterably yours, Portia. Weymouth, 1 October, 1775. To John Adams. Have pity upon me. Have pity upon me, O thou my beloved, for the hand of God presseth me sore. Yet will I be dumb and silent, and not open my mouth, because thou, O Lord, hast done it. How can I tell you, O my bursting heart, that my dear mother has left me? This day, about 5 o'clock, she left this world for an infinitely better. After sustaining 16 days' severe conflict, nature fainted, and she fell asleep. Blessed Spirit, where art thou? At times I am almost ready to faint under this severe and heavy stroke, separated from thee, who used to be a comforter to me in affliction. But blessed be God, his ear is not heavy that he cannot hear, but he has bid us call upon him in time of trouble. I know you are a sincere and hearty mourner with me, and will pray for me in my affliction. My poor father, like a firm believer and good Christian, sets before his children the best of examples of patience and submission. My sisters send their love to you and are greatly afflicted. You often expressed your anxiety for me when you left me before, surrounded with terrors, but my trouble then was as the small dust in the balance compared to what I have since endured. I hope to be properly mindful of the correcting hand, that I may not be rebuked in anger. You will pardon and forgive all my wanderings of mind. I cannot be correct. 'Tis a dreadful time with the whole province. Sickness and death are in almost every family. I have no more shocking and terrible idea of any distemper except the plague than this. Almighty God, restrain the pestilence which walketh in darkness and wasteth at noonday, and which has laid in the dust one of the dearest of parents. May the life of the other be lengthened out to his afflicted children. From your distressed Portia. End of Section 8. Section 9 of Letters of Mrs. Adams, Volume 1, by Charles Francis Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sue Anderson. Section 9, The Letters, 1775, Part 4. Braintree, 21 October, 1775. To John Adams. The sickness has abated here and in the neighboring towns. In Boston I am told it is very sickly among the inhabitants and the soldiery. By a man, one Haskins, who came out the day before yesterday, I learned that there are about 2,500 soldiers in town. How many there are at Charlestown he could not tell. He had been in irons 3 weeks, some malicious fellow having said that he saw him at the Battle of Lexington. But he proved that he was not out of Boston that day, upon which he was released, and went with 2 other men out in a small boat, under their eye, to fish. They played about near the shore while catching small fish, till they thought they could possibly reach Dorchester Neck. No sooner were they perceived attempting to escape than they had 20 cannons discharged at them, but they all happily reached the shore. He says no language can paint the distress of the inhabitants, most of them destitute of wood and of provisions of every kind. The bakers say, unless they have a new supply of wood, they cannot bake above 1 fortnight longer. Their biscuit are not above 1/2 the former size. The soldiers are obliged to do very hard duty, and are uneasy to a great degree, many of them declaring they will not continue much longer in such a state, but at all hazards will escape. The inhabitants are desperate, and contriving means of escape. A floating battery of ours went out 2 nights ago and rode near the town, and then discharged their guns. Some of the balls went into the workhouse, some through the tents in the common, and one through the sign of the Lamb Tavern. He says it drove them all out of the common, men, women, and children, screaming, and threw them into the utmost distress. But very unhappily for us, in the discharge of one of the cannon, the ball, not being properly rammed down, it split and killed 2 men and wounded 7 more, upon which they were obliged to return. He also says that the Tories are much distressed about the fate of Dr. Church, and very anxious to obtain him, and would exchange Lovell for him. This man is so exasperated at the ill usage he has received from them that he is determined to enlist immediately. They almost starved him whilst he was in irons. He says he hopes it will be in his power to send some of them to heaven for mercy. They are building a fort by the Haymarket and rending down houses for timber to do it with. In the course of the last week several persons have found means to escape. One of them says it is talked in town that Howe will issue a proclamation giving liberty to all who will not take up arms to depart the town, and making it death to have any intercourse with the country afterwards. At present it looks as if there was no likelihood of peace. The ministry are determined to proceed at all events. The people are already slaves, and have neither virtue nor spirit to help themselves nor us. The time is hastening when George, like Richard, may cry, "My kingdom for a horse," and want even that wealth to make the purchase. I hope by degrees we shall be inured to hardships, and become a virtuous, valiant people, forgetting our former luxury, and each one apply with industry and frugality to manufactures and husbandry, till we rival all other nations by our virtues. I thank you for your amusing account of the Quaker. Their great stress with regard to color in their dress, etc., is not the only ridiculous part of their sentiments with regard to religious matters. There's not a day but to the man of thought betrays some secret that throws new reproach on life and makes him sick of seeing more. What are your thoughts with regard to Dr. Church? Had you much knowledge of him? I think you had no intimate acquaintance with him. A foe to God was never true friend to man. Some sinister intent taints all he does. It is a matter of great speculation what will be his punishment. The people are much enraged against him. If he is set at liberty even after he has received a severe punishment, I do not think he will be safe. He will be despised and detested by every one, and many suspicions will remain in the minds of people in regard to our rulers. They are for supposing this person is not sincere, and that one they have jealousy of. Have you any prospect of returning? I hope to have heard from you by the gentlemen who came as a committee here, but they have been here a week and I have not any letters. My father and sister Betsy desire to be remembered to you. He is very disconsolate. It makes my heart ache to see him, and I know not how to go to the house. He said to me the other day, "Child, I see your mother, go to what part of the house I will." I think he has lost almost as much flesh as if he had been sick, and Betsy, poor girl, looks broken and worn with grief. These near connections, how they twist and cling about the heart, and, when torn off, draw the best blood from it. Each friend by fate snatched from us is a plume plucked from the wing of human vanity. Be so good as to present my regards to Mrs. Hancock. I hope she is very happy. Mrs. Warren called upon me on her way to Watertown. I wish I could as easily come to you as she can go to Watertown. But it is my lot. In the 12 years we have been married, I believe we have not lived together more than 6. If you could, with any conveniency, procure me the articles I wrote for, I should be very glad, more especially the needles and cloth. They are in such demand that we are really distressed for want of them. Adieu. I think of nothing further to add, but that I am, with the tenderest regard, your Portia. Braintree, 22 October, 1775. To John Adams. Mr. Lothrop called here this evening, and brought me yours of the 1st of October, a day which will ever be remembered by me, for it was the most distressing one I ever experienced. That morning I rose and went into my mother's room, not apprehending her so near her exit, went to her bed with a cup of tea in my hand, and raised her head to give it to her. She swallowed a few drops, gasped, and fell back upon her pillow, opening her eyes with a look that pierced my heart and which I shall never forget. It was the eagerness of a last look, and oh, the last sad silence of a friend. Yet she lived till 5 o'clock that day, but I could not be with her. My dear father prayed twice beside her bed that day. God Almighty was with him and supported him that day, and enabled him to go through the services of it. It was his communion day. He had there a tender scene to pass through, a young granddaughter, Betsy Cranch, joining herself to the church, and a beloved wife dying to pray for. Weeping children, weeping and mourning parishioners all round him, for every eye streamed, his own heart almost bursting as he spoke. How painful is the recollection, and yet how pleasing! I know I wound your heart. Why should I? Ought I to give relief to my own by painting yours? Yet the grief that cannot speak whispers the o'erfraught heart and bids it burst. My pen is always freer than my tongue. I have written many things to you that I suppose I never could have talked. My heart is made tender by repeated affliction. It never was a hard heart. The death of Patty came very near me, having lived 4 years with me under my care. I hope it will make me more continually mindful and watchful of all those who are still committed to my charge. 'Tis a great trust. I daily feel more and more of the weight and importance of it, and of my own inability. I wish I could have more of the assistance of my dearest friend, but these perilous times swallow him up. Mr. Lothrop has given me this account of the demand upon Falmouth. A man of war and 2 tenders went down, and sent to the inhabitants to demand their arms, and require them to stand neuter. They required time to consider. They had until 9 o'clock the next day, which time they employed in removing the women, children, and the rest of their most valuable effects out of danger, when they sent their answer in the negative. Upon this the enemy began a cannonade, and were continuing it when the express came away. Hitchborne and another gentleman got out of town in a small boat, one of the foggy nights we have had this week. I have not heard what intelligence he brings. Another person says that Howe enlarged all the prisoners but Lovell, and he would not come out. I have since seen the paraphrase, as it is called, note scurrilous publications made by the Tories and British officers in Boston during the siege. But 'tis as low as the mock oration, though no reflection upon your private character, further than immoderately whipping your scholars when you kept school, a crime anyone will acquit you of who knows you. As a specimen of the wit and humor it contained, I will give you the title: A Paraphrase upon the Second Epistle of John the Roundhead to James, the Prolocutor of the Rump Parliament, Dear Devil, etc. I had it, but it was when I was in so much distress that I cared nothing about it. I will mention, when I see you, the foolish conjectures of some, who want always to be finding out something extraordinary in whatever happens. I hope to hear often from you, which is all the alleviation I have in your absence, and is, next to seeing you, the greatest comfort of your Portia. 5 November 1775. To John Adams. I hope you have received several letters from me in this fortnight past. I wrote by Mr. Lynch and by Dr. Franklin, the latter of whom I had the pleasure of dining with, and of admiring him, whose character from my infancy I had been taught to venerate. I found him social but not talkative, and when he spoke, something useful dropped from his tongue. He was grave, yet pleasant and affable. You know I make some pretensions to physiognomy, and I thought I could read in his countenance the virtues of his heart, among which patriotism shone in its full lustre, and with that is blended every virtue of a Christian. For a true patriot must be a religious man. I have been led to think from a late defection (note of Dr. Church) that he who neglects his duty to his Maker may well be expected to be deficient and insincere in his duty towards the public. Even suppose him to possess a large share of what is called honor and public spirit, yet do not these men, by their bad example, by a loose, immoral conduct, corrupt the minds of youth and vitiate the morals of the age, and thus injure the public more than they can compensate by intrepidity, generosity, and honor. Let revenge or ambition, pride, lust, or profit tempt these men to a base and vile action, you may as well hope to bind up a hungry tiger with a cobweb as to hold such debauched patriots in the visionary chains of decency, or to charm them with the intellectual beauty of truth and reason. But where am I running? I mean to thank you for all your obliging favors lately received, and though some of them are very laconic, yet were they to contain only 2 lines to tell me you were well, they would be acceptable to me. I think, however, you are more apprehensive than you need be. The gentleman to whose care they have always been directed has been very kind in his conveyance, and very careful. I hope, however, that it will not now be long before we shall have nearer interviews. You must tell me that you will return next month. A late appointment will make it inconvenient, provided you accept, for you to go again to Congress. It seems human nature is the same in all ages and countries. Ambition and avarice reign everywhere, and where they predominate, there will be bickerings after places of honor and profit. There is an old adage, kissing goes by favor, that is daily verified. I enclose to you the paper you sent for. Your business in collecting facts will be very difficult, and the sufferings of this people cannot be described with pen, ink, and paper. Besides, these ministers of Satan are rendering it every day more and more difficult, by their ravages and devastation, to tell a tale which will freeze the young blood of succeeding generations, as well as harrow up the souls of the present. Nothing new has transpired since I wrote you last. I have not heard of one person's escape out of town, nor of any maneuver of any kind. I will only ask you to measure by your own the affectionate regard of your nearest friend. Braintree, 12 November, 1775. To John Adams. The intelligence you will receive before this reaches you will, I should think, make a plain path, though a dangerous one, for you. Note: this probably alludes to the act passed by the Provincial Congress on the 10th of the month to authorize privateering. I could not join today in the petitions of our worthy pastor for a reconciliation between our no longer parent state, but tyrant state, and these colonies. Let us separate. They are unworthy to be our brethren. Let us renounce them, and instead of supplications as formerly for their prosperity and happiness, let us beseech the Almighty to blast their counsels and bring to naught all their devices. I have nothing remarkable to write you. A little skirmish happened last week, the particulars I have endeavored to collect, but whether I have the facts right I am not certain. A number of cattle were kept at Lechmere's Point, where 2 sentinels were placed. In a high tide it is an island. The regulars had observed this, and a scheme was laid to send a number of them over and take off the stock. Accordingly, a number of boats and about 400 men were sent. They landed, it seems, unperceived by the sentinels, who were asleep, one of whom they killed and took the other prisoner. As soon as they were perceived, they fired the cannon from Prospect Hill upon them, which sunk one of their boats, but as the tide was very high, it was difficult getting over, and some time before any alarm was given. A Colonel Thompson of the Riflemen marched instantly with his men, and though a very stormy day, they regarded not the tide nor waited for boats, but marched over neck high in water and discharged their pieces, when the regulars ran, without waiting to get off their stock, and made the best of their way to the opposite shore. The general sent his thanks in a public manner to the brave officer and his men. Major Mifflin, I hear, was there, and flew about as though he would have raised the whole army. May they never find us deficient in courage and spirit. Dr. Franklin invited me to spend the winter in Philadelphia. I shall wish to be there unless you return. I have been like a nun in a cloister ever since you went away, and have not been into any other house than my father's and sister's, except once to Colonel Quincy's. Indeed, I have had no inclination for company. My evenings are lonesome and melancholy. In the daytime, family affairs take off my attention, but the evenings are spent with my departed parent. I then ruminate upon all her care and tenderness, and am sometimes lost and absorbed in a flood of tenderness ere I am aware of it, or can call to my aid my only prop and support. I must bid you adieu. 'Tis late at night. Most affectionately yours. 27 November, 1775. To John Adams. Colonel Warren returned last week to Plymouth, so that I shall not hear anything from you until he goes back again, which will not be till the last of this month. He damped my spirits greatly by telling me that the court (the general court of the province) had prolonged your stay another month. I was pleasing myself with the thought that you would soon be upon your return. It is in vain to repine. I hope the public will reap what I sacrifice. I wish I knew what mighty things we're fabricating. If a form of government is to be established here, what one will be assumed? Will it be left to our assemblies to choose one? And will not many men have many minds? And shall we not run into dissensions among ourselves? I am more and more convinced that man is a dangerous creature, and that power, whether vested in many or a few, is ever grasping, and like the grave cries, "Give, give." The great fish swallow up the small, and he who is most strenuous for the rights of the people, when vested with power, is as eager after the prerogatives of government. You tell me of degrees of perfection to which human nature is capable of arriving, and I believe it, but at the same time lament that our admiration should arise from the scarcity of the instances. The building up a great empire, which was only hinted at by my correspondent, may now, I suppose, be realized even by the unbelievers. Yet will not 10,000 difficulties arise in the formation of it? The reins of government have been so long slackened that I fear the people will not quietly submit to those restraints which are necessary for the peace and security of the community. If we separate from Britain, what code of laws will be established? How shall we be governed so as to retain our liberties? Can any government be free which is not administered by general stated laws? Who shall frame these laws? Who will give them force and energy? It is true your resolutions as a body have hitherto had the force of laws, but will they continue to have? When I consider these things, and the prejudices of people in favor of ancient customs and regulations, I feel anxious for the fate of our monarchy or democracy or whatever is to take place. I soon get lost in a labyrinth of perplexities, but whatever occurs, may justice and righteousness be the stability of our times, and order arise out of confusion. Great difficulties may be surmounted by patience and perseverance. I believe I have tired you with politics. As to news, we have not any at all. I shudder at the approach of winter, when I think I am to remain desolate. I must bid you good night. 'Tis late for me, who am much of an invalid. I was disappointed last week in receiving a packet by the post, and, upon unsealing it, finding only 4 newspapers. I think you are more cautious than you need be. All letters, I believe, have come safe to hand. I have 16 from you, and wish I had as many more. Adieu, yours. Braintree, 10 December, 1775. To John Adams. I received your obliging favor by Mrs. Morgan, with the papers and the other articles you sent, which were very acceptable to me, as they are not to be purchased here. I shall be very choice of them. I have, according to your desire, been upon a visit to Mrs. Morgan, who keeps at Major Mifflin's. I had received a message from Mrs. Mifflin some time ago, desiring I would visit her. My father, who you know is very obliging in this way, accompanied me, and I had the pleasure of drinking coffee with the doctor and his lady, the Major and his lady, and a Mr. and Mrs. Smith from New York, a daughter of the famous son of Liberty, Captain Sears, Generals Gates and Lee, a Dr. McHenry, and a Mr. Elwin, with many others who were strangers to me. I was very politely entertained and noticed by the generals, more especially General Lee, who was very urgent with me to tarry in town and dine with him and the ladies present at Hobgoblin Hall, but I excused myself. The general was determined that I should not only be acquainted with him, but with his companions too, and therefore placed a chair before me into which he ordered Mr Spada to mount and present his paw to me for a better acquaintance. I could not do otherwise than accept it. That, madam, says he, is the dog which Mr has rendered famous. I was so little while in company with these persons, and the company so mixed, that it was almost impossible to form any judgment of them. The doctor appeared modest, and his lady affable and agreeable. Major Mifflin, you know, I was always an admirer of, as well as of his delicate lady. I believe Philadelphia must be an unfertile soil, or it would not produce so many unfruitful women. I always conceive of these persons as wanting one addition to their happiness. But in these perilous times I know not whether it ought to be considered as an infelicity, since they are certainly freed from the anxiety every parent must feel for their rising offspring. I drank coffee one day with General Sullivan upon Winter Hill. He appears to be a man of sense and spirit. His countenance denotes him of a warm constitution, not to be very suddenly moved, but when once roused, not very easily lulled, easy and social, well calculated for a military station, as he seems to be possessed of those popular qualities necessary to attach men to him. By the way, I congratulate you upon our late noble acquisition of military stores. Note, by the capture of the brig Nancy, bound for Boston, with ordnance from Woolwich. It is a most grand mortar, I assure you. Surely heaven smiles upon us in many respects, and we have continually to speak of mercies as well as of judgments. I wish our gratitude may be anywise proportionate to our benefits. I suppose in Congress you think of everything relative to trade and commerce, as well as other things, but as I have been desired to mention to you some things, I shall not omit them. One is that there may be something done in a continental way with regard to excise upon spirituous liquors, that each of the New England colonies may be upon the same footing, whereas we formerly used to pay an excise and the other colonies none, or very little, by which means they drew away our trade. That an excise is necessary, though it may be objected to by the mercantile interest, as a too frequent use of spirits endangers the well-being of society. Another article is that some method may be devised to keep among us our gold and silver, which are now every day shipped off to the West Indies for molasses, coffee, and sugar. And this I can say of my own knowledge, that $1 in silver is now become a great rarity, and our traders will give you 100 pounds of paper for 90 of silver, or nearly that proportion. If any trade is allowed to the West Indies, would it not be better to carry some commodity of our own produce in exchange? Medicines, cotton wool, and some other articles we are in great want of. Formerly we used to purchase cotton wool at 1 shilling lawful money per bag. Now it is 3, and the scarcity of that article distresses us, as it was wrought up with less trouble than any other article of clothing. Flax is now from 1 shilling to 1 6 per pound, sheep's wool 18 pence, and linens not to be had at any price. I cannot mention the article in the English goods way, which is not double, and in the West India, molasses, by retail I used formerly to purchase at 1 8 pence, now it is 2 8 pence, rum 3 shillings, coffee 1 3 pence, and all other things in proportion. Corn is 4 shillings per bushel, rye 5, oats 3 8 pence, hay 5 6 shillings per hundred, wood 20 shillings per cord, but meat of all kinds cheap. My uncle Quincy desires to be remembered to you. He inquired when you talked of coming home. I told him you had not fixed any time. He says if you don't come soon he would advise me to procure another husband. He of all persons ought not to give me such advice, I told him, unless he set a better example himself. Be kind enough to burn this letter. It is written in great haste, and a most incorrect scrawl it is. But I cannot conclude without telling you we are all very angry with your House of Assembly for their instructions. Note: it is a little doubtful to what this alludes, probably to the application made by New Hampshire to Congress for advice to establish a form of government for itself. They raise prejudices in the minds of people, and serve to create in their minds a terror at a separation from a people wholly unworthy of us. We are a little of the spaniel kind, though so often spurned still to fawn, argues a meanness of spirit that as an individual I disclaim, and would rather endure any hardship than submit to it. Yours. End of section 9. Section 10 of Letters of Mrs. Adams, Volume 1, by Charles Francis Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sue Anderson. Section 10, The Memoir, Part 4. Mr. Adams was again at home in the month of December, during the sessions of the Congress, which were now continued without intermission. It was upon his departure for the third time that the long and very remarkable letter, bearing date March 2nd, 1776, and continued through several days, was written. A letter composed in the midst of the din of war, and describing hopes and fears in a manner deeply interesting. With this, the description of active scenes in the war terminates. The British force soon afterwards evacuated Boston and Massachusetts, which did not again become the field of military action. The correspondence now changes its character. From containing accounts of stirring events directly under the writer's eye, the letters assume a more private form, and principally relate to the management of the farm and the household. Few of these would be likely to amuse the general reader, yet some are necessary as specimens of a portion of the author's character. Mr. Adams was never a man of large fortune. His profession, which had been a source of emolument, was now entirely taken away from him, and his only dependence for the support of his family was in the careful husbanding of the means in actual possession. It is not giving to his wife too much credit to affirm that by her prudence through the years of the Revolution, and indeed during the whole period when the attention of her husband was engrossed by public affairs, she saved him from the mortification in his last days which some of those who have been, like him, elevated to the highest situations in the country, have, for want of such care, not altogether escaped. In the month of November, 1777, Mr. Adams again visited his home, and never afterwards rejoined the Congress, for that body, in his absence, had elected him to perform a duty in a distant land. This was destined to furnish a severe trial to the fortitude of Mrs. Adams. On the 25th of October she had written a letter to him, it being the anniversary of their wedding day, in which she notices the fact that, out of 13 years of their married life, 3 had been passed in a state of separation. Yet in these years the distance between them had never been very great, and the means of communication almost always reasonably speedy and certain. She appears little to have anticipated that in a few short weeks she was to be deprived of even these compensations, and to send her husband to a foreign country over seas covered with the enemy's ships. I very well remember, she says in an earlier letter, when the eastern circuits of the courts, which lasted a month, were thought an age, and an absence of 3 months intolerable. But we are carried from step to step, and from one degree to another, to endure that which first we think insupportable. It was in exact accordance with this process that the separations of half a year or more were to be followed by those which lasted many years, and the distance from Boston to Philadelphia or Baltimore was lengthened to Paris and a different quarter of the globe. Upon the reception of the news of his appointment as joint commissioner at the court of France, in the place of Silas Deane, Mr. Adams lost no time in making his arrangements for the voyage, but it was impossible for him to think of risking his wife and children all at once with him in so perilous an enterprise. The frigate Boston, a small and not very good vessel, mounting 28 guns, had been ordered to transport him to his destination. The British fleet, stationed at Newport, perfectly well knew the circumstances under which she was going, and was on the watch to favor the new commissioner with a fate similar to that afterwards experienced by Mr. Laurens. The political attitude of France still remained equivocal. Hence, on every account, it seemed advisable that Mr. Adams should go upon his mission alone. He left the shores of his native town to embark in the frigate in February, 1778, accompanied only by his eldest son, John Quincy Adams, then a boy not quite 11 years of age. It is not often that, even upon that boisterous ocean, a voyage combines greater perils of war and of the elements than did this of the Boston. Yet it is by no means unlikely that the lightning which struck the frigate and the winds that nearly sent it to the bottom were effective instruments to deter the enemy from a pursuit which threatened to end in capture. This is not, however, the place to enlarge upon this story. It is alluded to only as connected with the uneasiness experienced by Mrs. Adams, who was left alone to meditate upon the hazard to which her husband was exposed. Her letter, written not long after the sailing of the frigate, distinctly shows her feelings, but we find by it that to all the causes of anxiety which would naturally have occurred to her mind, there was superadded one growing out of a rumor then in circulation, that some British emissary had made an attempt upon the life of Dr. Frankland whilst acting at Paris in the very commission of which her husband had been made a part. This was a kind of apprehension as new as it was distressing, one too the vague nature of which tended infinitely to multiply those terrors that had a better foundation in reality. The news of the surrender of General Burgoyne had done more to hasten the desired acknowledgment by France of the independence of the United States than all the efforts which commissioners could have made. Upon his arrival in France, Mr. Adams found the great object of his mission accomplished, and himself consequently left with little or no occupation. He did not wait in Europe to know the further wishes of Congress, but returned home in August, 1779. Only a brief enjoyment of his society by his family was the result, inasmuch as in October he was again ordered by Congress to go to Europe, and there to wait until Great Britain should manifest an inclination to treat with him and terminate the war. In obedience to these directions, he sailed in November on board of the French frigate Sensible, taking with him upon this occasion his 2 eldest sons. The day of his embarkation is marked by a letter in the present collection, quite touching in its character. The ordinary occupations of the female sex are necessarily of a kind which must ever prevent it from partaking largely of the action of life. However keenly women may think or feel, There is seldom an occasion when the sphere of their exertions can, with propriety, be extended much beyond the domestic hearth or the social circle. Exactly here are they to be seen most in their glory. 3 or 4 years passed whilst Mrs. Adams was living in the utmost seclusion of country life, during which, on occasion of the increasing vigilance of British cruisers, she very seldom heard from her husband. The material for interesting letters was proportionately small, and yet there was no time when she was more usefully occupied. It is impossible to omit all notice of this period, however deficient it may prove in variety. The depreciation of the continental paper money, the difficulties in the way of managing the property of her husband, her own isolation, and the course of public events in distant parts of the country, form her constant topics. Only a small number of the letters which discuss them, yet enough to show her situation at this period, have been admitted into these volumes. They are remarkable, because they display the readiness with which she could devote herself to the most opposite duties, and the cheerful manner in which she could accommodate herself to the difficulties of the times. She is a farmer cultivating the land and discussing the weather and the crops, a merchant reporting prices current and the rates of exchange, and directing the making up of invoices, a politician speculating upon the probabilities of peace or war, and a mother writing the most exalted sentiments to her son. All of these pursuits she adopts together, some from choice, the rest from the necessity of the case, and in all she appears equally well. Yet among the letters of this period there will be found 2 or 3 which rise in their tone very far above the rest, and which can scarcely fail to awaken the sympathy of the coldest reader. End of section 10. Section 11 of Letters of Mrs. Adams, Volume 1, by Charles Francis Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sue Anderson. Section 11, The Letters, 1776. Saturday evening, 2 March, 1776. To John Adams. I was greatly rejoiced at the return of your servant to find you had safely arrived, and that you were well. I had never heard a word from you after you had left New York, and a most ridiculous story had been industriously propagated in this and the neighboring towns to injure the cause and blast your reputation, namely, that you and your president, note John Hancock, had gone on board of a man of war from New York and sailed for England. I should not mention so idle a report, but that it had given uneasiness to some of your friends, not that they in the least credited the report, but because the gaping vulgar swallowed the story. One man, note Dr. Church, had deserted them and proved a traitor, another might, etc. I assure you such high disputes took place in the public house of this parish that some men were collared and dragged out of the shop with great threats for reporting such scandalous lies, and an uncle of ours offered his life as a forfeit for you if the report proved true. However, it has been a 9 days' marvel, and will now cease. I heartily wish every Tory was extirpated from America. They are continually, by secret means, undermining and injuring our cause. I am charmed with the sentiments of common sense, and wonder how an honest heart, one who wishes the welfare of his country and the happiness of posterity, can hesitate one moment at adopting them. I want to know how these sentiments are received in Congress. I dare say there would be no difficulty in procuring a vote and instructions from all the assemblies in New England for independency. I most sincerely wish that now, in the lucky moment, it might be done. I have been kept in a continual state of anxiety and expectation ever since you left me. It has been said tomorrow and tomorrow for this month, but when the dreadful tomorrow will be, I know not. But hark! The house this instant shakes with the roar of cannon. I have been to the door, and find it is a cannonade from our army. Orders, I find, are come for all the remaining militia to repair to the lines Monday night by 12 o'clock. No sleep for me tonight, and if I cannot, who have no guilt upon my soul with regard to this cause, how shall the miserable wretches who have been the procurers of this dreadful scene, and those who are to be the actors, lie down with the load of guilt upon their souls? Sunday evening, 3 March. I went to bed after 12, but got no rest. The cannon continued firing, and my heart beat pace with them all night. We have had a pretty quiet day, but what tomorrow will bring forth, God only knows. Monday evening. Tolerably quiet. Today the militia have all mustered with 3 days' provision, and are all marched by 3 o'clock this afternoon, though their notice was no longer ago than 8 o'clock Saturday. And now we have scarcely a man but our regular guards, either in Weymouth, Hingham, Braintree, or Milton, and the militia from the more remote towns are called in as seacoast guards. Can you form to yourself an idea of our sensations? I have just returned from Penn's Hill, where I have been sitting to hear the amazing roar of cannon, and from whence I could see every shell which was thrown. The sound, I think, is one of the grandest in nature, and is of the true species of the sublime. 'Tis now an incessant roar, but oh! the fatal ideas which are connected with the sound. How many of our dear countrymen must fall! Tuesday morning. I went to bed about 12, and rose again a little after 1. I could no more sleep than if I had been in the engagement. The rattling of the windows, the jar of the house, the continual roar of 24-pounders, and the bursting of shells, give us such ideas, and realize a scene to us of which we could form scarcely any conception. About 6 this morning there was quiet. I rejoiced in a few hours' calm. I hear we got possession of Dorchester Hill last night. 4,000 men upon it today, lost but 1 man. The ships are all drawn round the town. Tonight we shall realize a more terrible scene still. I sometimes think I cannot stand it. I wish myself with you, out of hearing, as I cannot assist them. I hope to give you joy of Boston, even if it is in ruins, before I send this away. I am too much agitated to write as I ought, and languid for want of rest. Thursday, fast day. All my anxiety and distress is at present at an end. I feel disappointed. This day our militia are all returning without effecting anything more than taking possession of Dorchester Hill. I hope it is wise and just, but from all the muster and stir I hoped and expected more important and decisive scenes. I would not have suffered all I have for 2 such hills. Ever since the taking of that, we have had a perfect calm, nor can I learn yet what effect it has had in Boston. I do not hear of 1 person's escaping since. I was very much pleased with your choice of a committee for Canada. All those to whom I have ventured to show that part of your letter approve the scheme of the priest as a master-stroke of policy. I feel sorry that General Lee has left us, but his presence at New York was no doubt of great importance, as we have reason to think it prevented Clinton from landing and gathering together such a nest of vermin as would at least have distressed us greatly. But how can you spare him from here? Can you make his place good? Can you supply it with a man equally qualified to save us? How do the Virginians relish the troops said to be destined for them? Are they putting themselves into a state of defense? I cannot bear to think of your continuing in a state of supineness this winter. There is a tide in the affairs of men, which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures. Sunday evening. I had scarcely finished these lines when my ears were again assaulted by the roar of cannon. I could not write any further. My hand and heart will tremble at this domestic fury and fierce civil strife, which cumber all our parts, though blood and destruction are so much in use, and dreadful objects so familiar, yet is not pity choked, nor my heart grown callous. I feel for the unhappy wretches who know not where to fly for safety. I feel still more for my bleeding countrymen who are hazarding their lives and their limbs. A most terrible and incessant cannonade from 8:30 till 6 this morning. I hear we lost 4 men killed and some wounded in attempting to take the hill nearest the town, called Nook's Hill. We did some work, but the fire from the ships beat off our men, so that they did not secure it, but retired to the fort upon the other hill. I have not got all the particulars. I wish I had, but as I have an opportunity of sending this, I shall endeavor to be more particular in my next. If there are reinforcements here, I believe we shall be driven from the sea coast, but in whatever state I am, I will endeavor to be therewith content. Man wants but little here below, nor wants that little long. You will excuse this very incorrect letter. You see in what perturbation it has been written, and how many times I have left off. Adieu. Yours. Braintree, 7 April, 1776. To John Adams. I have received all the papers you sent, the oration and the magazines. In the small papers I sometimes find pieces begun and continued, for instance, Johnston's speech, but am so unlucky as not to get the papers in order and miss of seeing the whole. The removal of the army seems to have stopped the current of news. I want to know to what part of America they are now wandering. It is reported and credited that Manley has taken a schooner belonging to the fleet, richly laden with money, plate, and English goods, with a number of Tories. The particulars I have not yet learned. Yesterday the remains of our worthy General Warren were dug up on Bunker's Hill and carried into town, and on Monday are to be interred with all the honors of war. 10 April. The doctor was buried on Monday, the Masons walking in procession from the State House with the military in uniforms, and a large concourse of people attending. He was carried into the chapel, and there a funeral dirge was played, an excellent prayer by Dr. Cooper, and an oration by Mr. Morton, which I hope will be printed. I think the subject must have inspired him. A young fellow could not have wished a finer opportunity to display his talents. The amiable and heroic virtues of the deceased, recent in the minds of the audience, the noble cause to which he fell a martyr, their own sufferings and unparalleled injuries all fresh in their minds, must have given weight and energy to whatever could be delivered upon the occasion. The dead body, like that of Caesar, before their eyes, whilst each wound, like dumb mouths, did ope their ruby lips, to beg the voice and utterance of a tongue, Woe to the hands that shed this costly blood! A curse shall light upon their line. 11 April. I take my pen and write just as I can get time. My letters will be a strange mixture. I really am cumbered about many things, and scarcely know which way to turn myself. I miss my partner, and find myself unequal to the cares which fall upon me. I find it necessary to be the directress of our husbandry. I hope in time to have the reputation of being as good a farmeress as my partner has of being a good statesman. To ask you anything about your return would, I suppose, be asking a question which you cannot answer. Retirement, rural quiet, domestic pleasures, all must give place to the weighty cares of state. It would be meanly poor in solitude to hide an honest zeal unwarped by party rage. Though certain pains attend the cares of state, a good man owes his country to be great, should act abroad the high distinguished part, and show at least the purpose of his heart. I hope your Prussian general will answer the high character which is given of him. But we, who have been bred in a land of liberty, scarcely know how to give credit to so unjust and arbitrary a mandate of a despot. To cast off a faithful servant only for being the unhappy bearer of ill news degrades the man and dishonors the prince. The Congress, by employing him, have shown a liberality of sentiment not confined to colonies or continents, but, to use the words of common sense, have carried their friendship on a larger scale by claiming brotherhood with every European Christian, and may justly triumph in the generosity of the sentiment. Yesterday was taken and carried into Cohasset by 3 whaleboats who went from the shore on purpose, a snow from the Granadas, laden with 354 puncheons of West India rum, 43 barrels of sugar, 12,500 weight of coffee, a valuable prize. A number of eastern sloops have brought wood into town since the fleet sailed. We have a rumor of Admiral Hopkins being engaged with a number of ships and tenders off Rhode Island, and are anxious to know the event. Be so good as to send me a list of the vessels which sail with Hopkins, their names, weight of metal, and number of men, all the news you know, etc. I hear our jurors refuse to serve because the writs are issued in the King's name. Surely they are for independence. Write me how you do this winter. I want to say many things I must omit. It is not fit to wake the soul by tender strokes of art, or to ruminate upon happiness we might enjoy, lest absence become intolerable. Adieu, yours. I wish you would burn all my letters. Braintree, 7 May, 1776. To John Adams. How many are the solitary hours I spend ruminating upon the past and anticipating the future, whilst you, overwhelmed with the cares of state, have but a few moments you can devote to any individual. All domestic pleasures and enjoyments are absorbed in the great and important duty you owe your country. "For our country is, as it were, a secondary God and the first and greatest parent. It is to be preferred to parents, wives, children, friends, and all things, the gods only excepted, for if our country perishes, it is as impossible to save an individual as to preserve one of the fingers of a mortified hand." Thus do I suppress every wish and silence every murmur, acquiescing in a painful separation from the companion of my youth and the friend of my heart. I believe 'tis near 10 days since I wrote you a line. I have not felt in a humor to entertain you if I had taken up my pen. Perhaps some unbecoming invective might have fallen from it. The eyes of our rulers have been closed, and a lethargy has seized almost every member. I fear a fatal security has taken possession of them. Whilst the building is in flames, they tremble at the expense of water to quench it. In short, 2 months have elapsed since the evacuation of Boston, and very little has been done in that time to secure it, or the harbor, from future invasion. The people are all in a flame, and no one among us that I have heard of even mentions expense. They think universally that there has been an amazing neglect somewhere. Many have turned out as volunteers to work upon Noddle's Island, and many more would go upon Nantasket if the business was once set on foot. 'Tis a maxim of state that power and liberty are like heat and moisture. Where they are well mixed, everything prospers. Where they are single, they are destructive. A government of more stability is much wanted in this colony, and they are ready to receive it from the hands of the Congress. And since I have begun with maxims of state, I will add another, namely, that a people may let a king fall, yet still remain a people. But if a king let his people slip from him, he is no longer a king. And as this is most certainly our case, why not proclaim to the world in decisive terms your own importance? Shall we not be despised by foreign powers for hesitating so long at a word? I cannot say that I think you are very generous to the ladies, for whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. But you must remember that arbitrary power is like most other things which are very hard, very liable to be broken. And notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and, without violence, throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet. Charm by accepting, by submitting, sway, yet have our humor most when we obey. I thank you for several letters which I have received since I wrote last. They alleviate a tedious absence, and I long earnestly for a Saturday evening, and experience a similar pleasure to that which I used to find in the return of my friend upon that day after a week's absence. The idea of a year dissolves all my philosophy. Our little ones, whom you so often recommend to my care and instruction, shall not be deficient in virtue or probity, if the precepts of a mother have their desired effect. But they would be doubly enforced could they be indulged with the example of a father alternately before them. I often point them to their sire, engaged in a corrupted state, wrestling with vice and faction. 9 May. I designed to have finished the sheet, but an opportunity offering, I close only just informing you that May the 7th our privateers took 2 prizes in the bay, in fair sight of the man of war, one a brig from Ireland, the other from Fayal, loaded with wine, brandy, etc., the other with beef, etc. The wind was east and a flood tide, so that the tenders could not get out, though they tried several times. The lighthouse fired signal guns, but all would not do. They took them in triumph and carried them into Lynn. Pray be kind enough to remember me at all times, and write as often as you possibly can to your Portia. End of Section 11.